Allegory of the Cave. Plato's Allegory of the Cave, found in Book 7 of the Republic, is one of the most significant and enduring philosophical metaphors in the Western tradition. At its core, it is a study of human perception, ignorance, enlightenment, and the painful process of coming to know reality. The image is stark. A group of prisoners is chained deep inside a cave, their legs and necks fixed so they can only look straight ahead. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners is a raised walkway. Along this path, other figures walk, carrying statues and objects. These cast shadows onto the wall in front of the prisoners, and the prisoners, never having seen anything else, take these shadows to be the only reality. The echoes of the objects' movement become the only sounds they know. The prisoners give names to the shadows, discuss them, and form entire belief systems based on them. In this world, illusion becomes truth. Then Plato imagines what would happen if one prisoner were suddenly freed. At first, the fire's light would blind him. The reality behind the shadows would be disorienting. If he were dragged out of the cave entirely, the sunlight outside would cause even more pain. But slowly, as his eyes adjusted, he would begin to perceive the world as it truly is, first reflections in water, then objects themselves, and finally, the sun, which Plato equates with the form of the good, the ultimate source of truth and understanding. This escape is not merely physical, it is intellectual and spiritual. It represents the philosopher's ascent from ignorance to knowledge, from belief to true understanding. But Plato also emphasizes what happens when the freed prisoner returns to the cave. He is no longer accustomed to the darkness and stumbles. The other prisoners, seeing his confusion, mock him. If he tries to free them or explain the world outside, they become hostile. They do not want to be freed. They are content in their illusions, and they view any challenge to those illusions as dangerous. The allegory is layered. It is a theory of education. Learning is not a simple accumulation of information, but a painful process of turning the soul toward the light. It is a political statement. The philosopher who perceives truth will not be welcomed in the city, but ridiculed or even attacked. It is also an epistemological claim. Most people live in a world of appearance, not reality, and few are willing or able to pursue genuine knowledge. Plato's cave continues to resonate today because the wall of shadows still exists. It may be composed of television screens, curated social media feeds, political propaganda, or cultural myths. We're still at risk of mistaking appearances for truth, still hesitant to question what we think we know. The path out of the cave, out of comfort, ignorance, and conformity, is still as difficult and necessary as it was in ancient Athens. The Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus is a classic thought experiment in metaphysics that raises profound questions about identity, continuity, and change over time. It begins with a simple scenario. A ship, once belonging to the mythical Greek hero Theseus, is preserved by a city as a symbol of heritage. Over the years, the wooden planks of the ship begin to rot, and one by one they are replaced with identical new ones. Eventually, every part of the ship, every mast, every board, every nail has been replaced. At this point, we are asked, is it still the same ship? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. The ship was preserved through careful maintenance, and each replacement was done with the intention of preserving its identity. It still looks like the same ship, serves the same function, and carries the same name. But here comes the twist. What if someone gathered all the original discarded planks and reassembled them elsewhere, creating a second ship? Which one, if either, is the real ship of Theseus? This problem challenges the idea that objects have fixed, enduring identities. Is identity tied to material continuity, the original parts, or to structural continuity, the form and function maintained over time? If both ships have a legitimate claim to being the original, does that mean identity can be duplicated, or does it suggest that neither is truly the same ship, and the original was lost the moment its first piece was replaced. Philosophers have debated this question for centuries because it highlights deeper problems about personal identity, especially as it relates to human beings. Our bodies are constantly changing, cells die and regenerate. Our personalities evolve, memories fade, and new experiences reshape our sense of self. Are you the same person you were 5, 10, or 20 years ago? If your physical makeup and your mental framework have both changed, what, if anything, has remained constant? In modern contexts, the ship of Theseus has been applied to questions in technology, bioethics, and artificial intelligence. If you replace every part of a robot, is it still the same robot? If you upload a mind to a computer and then copy it, do both versions remain you? The thought experiment is no longer just abstract. It's relevant to real-world questions about digital identity, medical prosthetics, and the ethics of cloning. Ultimately, the ship of Theseus reveals that identity is not as stable as we might assume. It forces us to consider whether continuity lies in the materials that compose a thing, in the narrative we tell about it, or in something else altogether. The question has no definitive answer, but that's precisely its power. It keeps us thinking, even when the ship has long since sailed. The trolley problem. The trolley problem is one of the most influential and disturbing thought experiments in moral philosophy. First introduced by Philippa Foot in 1967, and later expanded by Judith Jarvis Thomson, the scenario is deceptively simple, but opens a vast terrain of ethical reflection. A runaway trolley is heading down a track toward 5 workers who cannot move out of the way in time. You are standing near a lever. If you do nothing, the trolley will continue on its course and kill all 5. But if you pull the lever, the trolley will switch to a different track where only 1 worker is present. Pulling the lever will save 5 lives. But at the cost of 1, this scenario presents a clear moral dilemma. Is it more ethical to take an action that results in 1 death to save 5, or to refrain from acting and allow more people to die? On one level, it seems obvious. The utilitarian answer would be to pull the lever, minimizing harm and maximizing well-being. 5 lives are more valuable than 1, in purely numerical terms. But the moment you act, you are no longer a passive observer. You become directly responsible for the death of the 1 person. This introduces a deontological concern that the morality of an action is not just about consequences, but also about the nature of the act itself. Some would argue that deliberately causing the death of an innocent person, even to save others, is a moral violation that cannot be justified. Judith Jarvis Thomson expanded the dilemma with further variations. In one version, you are on a footbridge above the track. A large man stands beside you. If you push him onto the track, his body will stop the trolley and save the 5 people. Most people who would pull the lever in the original scenario now hesitate. The numbers are the same, 5 versus 1, but the means have changed. Physically pushing someone to their death feels more personal, more intentional, and therefore more morally troubling. These variations highlight an important point. Our moral intuitions are shaped not only by outcomes, but by the mechanisms through which those outcomes are achieved. The trolley problem forces us to confront the inconsistency and complexity of our moral reasoning. It also raises questions about responsibility, intention, and the permissibility of harm. In the modern era, the trolley problem is no longer just a philosophical puzzle. It is being actively considered in the design of autonomous vehicles, medical triage systems, and military drones. How should a self-driving car respond in a no-win scenario? Should it swerve to save 5 pedestrians at the cost of its passenger's life? These are not theoretical questions. They are design decisions being made now. The trolley problem endures not because it provides clear answers, but because it reveals how difficult moral choices can be when values clash. It shows that behind every principle lies a deeper set of assumptions, and that ethics often involves navigating between equally troubling options, rather than choosing between obvious right and wrong. Determinism versus free will. The debate between determinism and free will is one of the most enduring and foundational in all of philosophy. At its core, it concerns a single, unsettling question: are our choices truly our own? Determinism is the belief that every event, including every human thought and action, is the inevitable result of preceding causes. If the universe operates according to consistent physical laws, then, in principle, everything that happens, including your decision to read this sentence, was predetermined by prior conditions. The Big Bang set off a chain of events, and every atom, neuron, and synapse has followed from that initial burst of energy. From this view, the idea of choice is an illusion. We feel like we choose, but we are simply enacting a script written by physics, biology, and history. This deterministic view raises uncomfortable implications for morality and justice. If our actions are determined, can we be held responsible for them? Can we praise generosity or condemn cruelty if neither the generous nor the cruel had any real choice in the matter? Determinism does not excuse behavior. It simply reframes it as the final link in a causal chain that extends beyond any individual's control. On the other side stands the concept of free will, the idea that human beings possess genuine agency, that we can make choices independently of external compulsion or internal predetermination. According to this view, we deliberate, consider options, and then choose. Free will underpins our legal systems, moral frameworks, and cultural narratives. We hold people accountable because we assume they could have done otherwise. Some philosophers argue that determinism and free will are incompatible. This is known as incompatibilism. But others propose a middle path, compatibilism. This view holds that determinism and free will can coexist. Compatibilists argue that being free doesn't mean being uncaused. It means acting according to one's own motivations without external coercion. Even if our desires have causes, as long as we act in line with them, we are free in a meaningful sense. Contemporary science has complicated this debate. Neuroscientific experiments have shown that brain activity often predicts decisions before we become consciously aware of them. Some interpret this as evidence against free will. Our brains decide before we do. Others caution against over-interpreting such findings, pointing out that the presence of unconscious influence does not negate all conscious control. Ultimately, the question may not be whether we are free in some absolute sense, but what kind of freedom matters. Can we live meaningfully if our decisions are shaped, but not forced? Can we be responsible if we are influenced, but not puppeteered? Whether one leans toward determinism, free will, or compatibilism, the debate forces us to reconsider what it means to act, to choose, and to be human in a universe that may or may not be already written. Existential angst. Existential angst refers to a specific kind of anxiety that arises not from fear of failure or pain, but from the confrontation with existence itself. It is not tied to any particular threat or danger. Rather, it emerges when we pause long enough to ask the questions that sit beneath the surface of our daily lives. Why am I here? What am I supposed to do with this life? Does anything truly matter? This concept is central to existentialist philosophy, a 20th century movement associated with thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard, Jean-Paul Sartre, Martin Heidegger, and Albert Camus. Although these philosophers differ in many ways, they share a basic concern with the individual's experience of freedom, meaning, and alienation in an indifferent or even absurd universe. Kierkegaard described angst as the dizziness of freedom. He believed that human beings are not fixed like animals or objects. We are capable of choosing, of shaping our lives, but with that power comes uncertainty and dread. When we recognize that no external authority, no tradition, institution, or divine order can tell us what to do, we experience existential anxiety. We are free, but also responsible. We must decide who to be, without guarantees. Sartre took this idea further. For him, existence precedes essence. In other words, we are not born with a predetermined purpose. We exist first, and only later define ourselves through our choices and actions. This is both a burden and a liberation. Sartre called this condition, condemned to be free. We cannot avoid responsibility for our lives, even if we wish we could. There is no script to follow, no moral map handed down from on high. That realization is what gives rise to existential angst. Heidegger focused more on the temporal nature of existence. He called this anxiety angst and distinguished it from fear. Fear has an object, something specific and external, but angst reveals the nothingness behind everyday distractions. It shows us that the structures we rely on, social roles, routines, even language, are not fixed. They can collapse, and when they do, we glimpse the raw, unstructured nature of being. But existential angst is not just despair. Camus, for instance, saw the absurd as a call to revolt, not in anger, but in defiance of meaninglessness. To live authentically in the face of absurdity is to take ownership of one's life, to create value even when none is given. Existential angst, then, is a confrontation with freedom, uncertainty, and meaning. It is deeply uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying. It strips away illusion and forces us to reckon with what it means to live a human life without assurances. In doing so, it invites us to live not by default, but by decision. Nihilism. Nihilism is the philosophical belief that life lacks inherent meaning, value, or purpose. It challenges the foundations of ethics, knowledge, truth, and existence itself. To accept nihilism is to accept that the systems we use to organize and justify our lives, morality, religion, law, even language, are ultimately human constructs, not reflections of some objective, universal order. While forms of nihilistic thinking can be found in ancient traditions, the term became especially significant in 19th and 20th century philosophy, particularly through the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche did not advocate for nihilism. He diagnosed it. He saw it as a growing force in European culture, especially after the decline of traditional religious belief. His famous declaration that God is dead was not a celebration, but a warning. With the collapse of belief in God and the absolute moral order that accompanied it, Western civilization was heading into a crisis. Without a divine anchor, what remains to give life meaning? Nihilism appears in several forms. Moral nihilism denies the existence of objective moral truths. It claims that concepts like good and evil are invented, not discovered. Epistemological nihilism questions whether we can truly know anything with certainty. Existential nihilism, perhaps the most widely discussed form, holds that life has no intrinsic purpose or value, that in the grand scheme of the universe, human existence is accidental and without significance. These conclusions are not merely academic. For many, nihilism becomes a personal crisis. If nothing matters, why bother doing anything at all? This can lead to despair, apathy, or hedonism, a sense that one might as well seek pleasure or distraction, since nothing deeper can be achieved. Nietzsche feared this kind of passive nihilism, which he believed would lead to cultural decay and spiritual stagnation. In response, he proposed an alternative, active nihilism. Instead of collapsing under the weight of lost meaning, active nihilism embraces the void as an opportunity. If traditional values no longer hold, then we must create new ones. Rather than look outward for purpose, we turn inward and build our own frameworks for value. This was part of what Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values. Nihilism remains a powerful and unsettling force in modern thought. It confronts us with the possibility that the universe is not a story with a moral arc or a destiny. It is silent, indifferent. Whether this is a curse or a freedom depends on how we respond. To accept nihilism is not to abandon meaning. It is to recognize that meaning, if it is to exist at all, must be created, not found. Solipsism. Solipsism is the philosophical position that only one's own mind is certain to exist. All external reality, other people, objects, even the passage of time could be an illusion or a projection of one's own consciousness. While few philosophers accept solipsism as a practical worldview, it remains one of the most unsettling and logically rigorous positions ever formulated. At its heart is a question that resists easy dismissal. How can you be absolutely sure that anything outside your mind is real? The basic logic of solipsism begins with the recognition that all our experiences, sights, sounds, sensations, thoughts, are mediated by our own consciousness. You never experience the world directly. What you see is not the world itself, but an internal representation of it. You do not hear a voice. You interpret a pattern of vibrations as sound. You do not touch an object. Your nerves signal to your brain that something has been touched. This barrier between perception and reality makes it impossible to conclusively prove that anything outside your subjective experience truly exists. René Descartes, in the 17th century, famously grappled with this dilemma. In his meditations on first philosophy, he doubted everything he could, the evidence of the senses, the body, even mathematics. The one thing he could not doubt was that he was doubting. From this he formulated cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But while Descartes used this as a starting point to rebuild belief in the external world, solipsists stop at that first conclusion. If only the thinking self is certain, then everything else remains unverified. Solipsism is not just a metaphysical problem, it is also a psychological and ethical one. If other people might not exist, what responsibilities do you have toward them? Can empathy survive in a worldview that reduces others to imagined projections? Can love or guilt or friendship be real if their objects are not? Most people find these implications absurd or disturbing, and yet the solipsistic challenge cannot be dismissed on emotional grounds alone. In practice, solipsism is often rejected, not because it has been disproven, but because it is unlivable. Even if the world might be an illusion, we behave as if it is real. The philosopher George Berkeley responded to solipsism not by denying perception's unreliability, but by claiming that all reality exists within the perception of God. Others embrace realism and intersubjectivity. We cannot prove that others exist, but shared language, behavior, and mutual unpredictability make their existence the best explanation. Solipsism forces us to confront the limits of certainty. It reminds us that belief in the external world is at some level an act of faith, an assumption that behind the appearance of other minds lies something like our own. It is not a comforting philosophy, but it is a rigorous one. And even if no one else exists, the question still does. The problem of evil. The problem of evil is one of the oldest and most serious challenges to the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God. The argument is straightforward. If God is omnipotent, he has the power to prevent evil. If he is omniscient, he knows when and where evil will occur. If he is omnibenevolent, he would not allow suffering without good reason. And yet, evil exists in the form of natural disasters, disease, war, injustice, and human cruelty. How can this be reconciled? This question is not merely theological. It strikes at the heart of moral and metaphysical reasoning. The problem takes two primary forms: the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem. The logical problem claims that the existence of any evil at all is incompatible with the existence of a perfect God. This is the strongest version of the argument. The evidential problem, on the other hand, argues that the amount, intensity, and apparent randomness of evil make God's existence unlikely. For example, why would a loving God allow a child to die in agony from an illness, or permit genocides and mass starvation? Philosophers and theologians have proposed several responses, often called theodicies. One of the most prominent is the free will defense. According to this view, God allows moral evil because he has given humans free will. Without the possibility to choose wrongly, true freedom could not exist. And without freedom, love, virtue, and moral responsibility would lose meaning. In this framework, evil is a necessary risk of autonomy. Another response is the soul-making theodicy, associated with Irenaeus and later John Hick. It suggests that suffering is necessary for moral and spiritual growth. Just as strength is forged through struggle, virtues like courage, empathy, and resilience require hardship. A world with challenges, even tragedies, is the kind of world in which meaningful human development occurs. Others propose that God's purposes are simply beyond human understanding. This is the skeptical theist approach. We cannot expect finite minds to grasp the full picture. Just as a child may not understand a parent's difficult decisions, we may be in no position to judge God's reasoning. But this raises troubling implications. If we cannot judge what counts as unjust suffering, then moral evaluation becomes uncertain. The problem of evil remains unsolved. For believers, it is a test of faith and reason. For skeptics, it is strong evidence against the traditional conception of God. What makes the problem enduring is not just its logical form, but its emotional force. People suffer, injustice exists, and any worldview that cannot account for that fact, either by explaining it or responding to it, remains incomplete. The Sorites paradox. The Sorites paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, originates from ancient Greek philosophy and challenges how we handle vague concepts. The term Sorites comes from the Greek word for heap, and the classic version of the paradox goes something like this. A single grain of sand does not make a heap. If you add 1 grain, you still do not have a heap. If you continue adding 1 grain at a time, at what exact point do you go from not a heap to a heap? There seems to be no precise moment of transition, yet a heap clearly does emerge eventually. The paradox applies not only to heaps of sand, but to a wide range of real-world concepts. At what point does a man go from not bald to bald? When does a person become old? How many dollars make someone rich? These are all examples of vague predicates, terms that lack a sharp boundary. The problem is that natural language is full of such terms, and yet we use them as though they have precise meanings. The core of the paradox is this: if removing a single grain of sand doesn't stop something from being a heap, then removing 1 grain repeatedly should never eliminate the heap. But clearly, if you keep removing grains, you'll eventually have just 1 grain, or none at all, which is certainly not a heap. This contradiction exposes a failure in how we apply logic to vague categories. Philosophers and logicians have proposed various ways to resolve the Sorites paradox. One approach is fuzzy logic, which allows for degrees of truth. In this framework, a collection of grains can be somewhat a heap, mostly a heap, or barely a heap, depending on the number of grains. Truth is no longer binary, but exists on a continuum. This softens the sharp transitions assumed by classical logic and more closely reflects how people actually think and speak. Another approach is epistemicism, which holds that there really is a precise cutoff point between heap and not a heap, but we simply don't know what it is. This preserves classical logic, but accepts that we are often ignorant of the precise boundaries. Still others advocate for contextualism, suggesting that terms like heap shift in meaning depending on conversational context. What counts as a heap in one situation may not count in another. The Sorites paradox may seem trivial at first glance, but its implications are far-reaching. It forces us to confront the limitations of everyday language, the assumptions of formal logic, and the blurry boundaries that define human categorization. In a world full of continua, our demand for discrete definitions may be more a cognitive convenience than a reflection of reality. Dualism versus monism. At the heart of metaphysical philosophy lies a fundamental question: what is the nature of reality? Specifically, what is the relationship between mind and matter? the mental and the physical. Two major positions dominate this debate: dualism and monism. Each offers a radically different account of what exists and how the components of reality interact. Dualism, most famously articulated by René Descartes, posits that reality is composed of two fundamentally different substances, res cogitans and res extensa. In Descartes' framework, the mind is a non-physical, thinking substance, conscious, intentional, and private. The body, by contrast, is a physical object governed by the laws of nature. While the mind and body interact, they remain ontologically distinct. This division is often called substance dualism. Descartes' dualism was not just a metaphysical claim, it also had theological implications. It preserved the soul as immaterial and immortal, consistent with Christian doctrine. But it introduced a deep problem known as the mind-body interaction problem. If the mind is non-physical and the body is physical, how can they affect each other? What kind of bridge exists between two substances that are completely unlike one another? Monism, on the other hand, argues that reality is made of only one kind of substance. This view comes in different forms. Materialist monism claims that everything, including thoughts, emotions, and consciousness, is ultimately physical. According to this view, the mind is not a separate thing. It is a function or emergent property of the brain. When neurons fire, thoughts arise. Mental states are brain states. In contrast, idealist monism, as defended by philosophers like George Berkeley, holds that everything is ultimately mental. In this view, the physical world is a projection or construct of consciousness. To what we perceive as material is just a set of mental experiences arranged coherently by the mind, or perhaps by God. A third, more complex form of monism is neutral monism, which argues that both mental and physical phenomena are manifestations of a more fundamental, neutral substance that is neither mind nor matter. Thinkers like Baruch Spinoza and Bertrand Russell explored versions of this view, suggesting that our distinctions might be artifacts of perspective rather than ontology. Today, the debate between dualism and monism continues, especially in philosophy of mind and neuroscience. While most scientists lean toward physicalism, the mystery of consciousness, the subjective, first-person experience, remains a stubborn challenge. Why should brain activity produce the feeling of pain, the color red, or the taste of coffee? No theory yet explains this transformation satisfactorily. Whether one accepts the dualist claim of two realms or the monist assertion of one unified substance, the question touches everything from ethics to identity to the possibility of life after death. To ask what the world is made of is to ask what we are made of, and that question remains as alive today as it was in Descartes' time. Moral relativism. Moral relativism is the philosophical position that moral judgments are not universally true, but are instead relative to cultural, societal, or individual perspectives. According to this view, what is considered right or wrong, just or unjust, is not fixed by any objective moral standard, but is instead determined by local norms, traditions, or personal values. This stands in contrast to moral absolutism, which maintains that there are objective moral truths that apply to all people at all times, regardless of context. Relativism comes in various forms. Cultural relativism holds that moral codes are created and sustained within particular societies, and that one cannot evaluate one culture's morality using the standards of another. For example, practices like arranged marriage, ritual sacrifice, or dietary laws may seem morally questionable or even abhorrent to outsiders, but are often defended within their originating cultures as morally appropriate. Cultural relativism does not merely describe differences, it insists that there is no external standpoint from which to judge them. Individual relativism, sometimes called ethical subjectivism, goes a step further by claiming that moral truth is determined by the individual. In this view, statements like lying is wrong are not claims about the world, but about the speaker's personal attitudes. If a person sincerely believes that lying is acceptable in certain situations, then for that person, it is. The appeal of moral relativism lies in its rejection of ethnocentrism and dogmatism. It encourages tolerance, humility, and cross-cultural understanding. It reminds us that moral frameworks evolve over time, and what is considered immoral in one era or place may become acceptable or even admirable in another. For example, same-sex marriage, once widely condemned, is now legally and morally accepted in many societies. However, moral relativism is not without significant challenges. The most pressing is the problem of moral criticism. If no culture's moral code is objectively better than another's, can we rightly condemn slavery, genocide, or systemic oppression when practiced or justified within a different cultural framework? If morality is entirely relative, then no culture, however brutal, can be said to be wrong in any meaningful sense. This conclusion sits uneasily with our intuitions about justice and human rights. Furthermore, relativism risks collapsing into moral nihilism, the idea that no actions are truly right or wrong. If all moral opinions are equally valid, then there is no rational basis for moral debate, reform, or progress. Everything becomes a matter of preference, like taste in food or music. Despite these concerns, moral relativism continues to play a critical role in ethical discourse. It forces us to question the sources of our values, to examine the boundaries of moral universality, and to navigate the tension between cultural respect and moral accountability. Tabula rasa. Tabula rasa, Latin for blank slate, is a foundational concept in epistemology and theories of human development. The term is most famously associated with John Locke, who in his 1690 work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, proposed that the human mind is empty at birth, like a clean sheet of paper, and that all knowledge arises through experience. For Locke, there are no innate ideas, no inborn concepts or moral principles. Instead, the mind acquires knowledge through sensation and reflection, the raw data of the world processed by internal reasoning. Locke's theory was a direct challenge to earlier rationalist thinkers, particularly René Descartes, who held that certain ideas, such as those of God, self, or number, are inborn and universally shared. Against this, Locke argued that if ideas were innate, we would expect children and those in all cultures to possess them. But this is clearly not the case. Differences in belief, knowledge, and behavior across societies point to the influence of environment, education, and experience. Tabula rasa has significant implications beyond epistemology. In education, it implies that individuals are shaped primarily by their surroundings, instruction, and culture. This view underpinned Enlightenment ideas about human perfectibility and the power of rational institutions to mold better citizens. If people are not inherently wise or depraved, but instead shaped by their experiences, then reforming society becomes a pathway to progress. In politics, tabula rasa fed into social contract theory. Thinkers like Locke and Rousseau believed that humans are born neither good nor evil, but become what their societies make them. This assumption supports the idea that political structures are not reflections of human nature, but instruments that form it. In modern science, tabula rasa has been contested and modified. Advances in genetics, neuroscience, and evolutionary psychology show that humans are not entirely blank at birth. Infants display innate preferences, such as recognizing faces or responding to certain patterns of sound. Language acquisition, emotional responses, and moral instincts appear to have biological underpinnings. This does not negate the role of environment, but it complicates the picture. Nature and nurture interact in complex, reciprocal ways. Critics of strict tabula rasa models argue that denying innate traits leads to unrealistic expectations in education, social engineering, and moral theory. However, defenders maintain that the blank slate, while not absolute, is a valuable metaphor, emphasizing human adaptability and potential. Ultimately, tabula rasa is not just a theory about minds. It is a statement about freedom. It asserts that we are not born predetermined, but are formed through the lives we live. That fact places enormous responsibility on the shoulders of educators, parents, and society as a whole. If we are shaped by our environments, then creating good environments is not optional. It is essential. The absurd. The concept of the absurd lies at the heart of existential philosophy and reflects a fundamental tension between the human need for meaning and the apparent silence of the universe. We are meaning-making creatures. We build narratives, invent religions, create art, formulate laws, all in pursuit of purpose, coherence, and significance. Yet when we turn to the universe for answers, we are met with indifference. The world does not explain itself. It offers no final verdict about who we are, why we exist, or how we ought to live. This dissonance is what existentialists call the absurd. Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, presents the absurd not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be faced. Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill only for it to roll back down forever, becomes the symbol of the absurd hero. His task is meaningless by any objective standard, yet Camus famously concludes that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because meaning does not have to be discovered, it can be created. Camus distinguishes between two types of responses to the absurd: escape and revolt. Escape includes religion, ideological certainty, or nihilistic despair, any attempt to deny or mask the absurdity of existence. Revolt, on the other hand, is a refusal to look away. It means facing the absurd honestly, without illusions, and choosing to live anyway. This is not resignation, but defiance. To live fully, without appeal to a higher meaning, is to become truly free. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir also address the absurd, though with different emphasis. For Sartre, the absurd stems from existence preceding essence. We are thrown into existence without a predefined purpose and must create our own essence through action. Life has no script. We must write it ourselves. The absurd is not a flaw in the universe. It is a reflection of our radical freedom. The absurd is not about despair. It is about lucidity. It acknowledges that while the universe may not provide meaning, the human response can be dignified, courageous, and even joyful. In recognizing the absurd, we are no longer beholden to false hope or external validation. We are free to live deliberately and authentically. In this way, the absurd is not a philosophical dead end, but a beginning. It calls us to live without appeal, to affirm life in spite of its indifference, and to recognize that the absence of inherent meaning does not negate the value of experience. It compels us to give it meaning ourselves. Eternal recurrence. Eternal recurrence is a provocative and deeply unsettling philosophical idea, most famously associated with Friedrich Nietzsche. It asks, what if every moment in your life, every joy, every pain, every mistake and triumph had to be lived over again, not once, but infinitely? What if, at the end of your life, you returned to its beginning and repeated every detail exactly, without variation, again and again, forever? Nietzsche presents this idea in The Gay Science, and later in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, not as a metaphysical claim about time, but as a thought experiment, an ethical and existential challenge. Imagine a demon confronting you in a moment of solitude and asking whether you would be willing to live your life over, down to the last gesture and breath, an infinite number of times. Would you curse the demon, or would you embrace the repetition? The value of this idea lies not in its literal plausibility, but in what it demands from the person who considers it. Eternal recurrence is in Nietzsche's hands a test of life affirmation. Can you say yes to your existence in its totality, not only to your achievements, but to your failures, your boredom, your suffering? Can you will not just isolated moments, but the whole of your life? Nietzsche's goal was not to propose a new cosmology, but to overturn the mindset that sees life as something to be endured for the sake of something beyond: heaven, redemption, progress. He was deeply critical of life-denying worldviews that devalue the present by focusing on a future ideal. In contrast, eternal recurrence demands that we treat every moment as eternally significant. If you must live your life again, exactly as it is, would you live it differently? The idea also poses serious challenges. Many people would not willingly relive their lives. Regret, trauma, mediocrity, these weigh heavily on most. Eternal recurrence forces us to confront whether we are truly living lives we affirm, or merely surviving them. For Nietzsche, only the Übermensch, the overman, could fully embrace eternal recurrence. This is not a superhuman figure in the physical sense, but one who creates values from within, who accepts reality without appeal to illusion, and who wills life as it is. Eternal recurrence is not a prescription for hedonism or recklessness. It is a demand for integrity. It asks whether you are living in such a way that you could, without shame or fear, live it all again. It confronts you with the weight of time, not as something to escape, but as something to honor. Social contract theory. Social contract theory is a cornerstone of modern political philosophy. It attempts to explain the origin of societies and the legitimacy of political authority by imagining an implicit agreement between individuals and the state. Rather than grounding authority in divine right or tradition, social contract theory bases it on reason, mutual benefit, and consent. The concept emerged most fully during the Enlightenment, especially in the works of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Although each theorist presents a distinct vision, all share a basic structure. Human beings begin in a pre-political state of nature, where there are no formal laws or governments. In this condition, life may be free, but it is also uncertain, insecure, or dangerous. To escape these conditions, individuals agree, explicitly or implicitly, to form a society. In doing so, they surrender certain freedoms in exchange for protection, order, and the rule of law. Thomas Hobbes, writing in the shadow of civil war, imagined the state of nature as a state of perpetual conflict, a war of every man against every man. Without a sovereign authority to enforce peace, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, people consent to an absolute sovereign, not because it is ideal, but because it is preferable to anarchy. The legitimacy of the state derives from its ability to prevent chaos. John Locke offered a more optimistic view. He saw the state of nature as governed by natural law, where people have inherent rights to life, liberty, and property. But without an impartial authority, these rights are insecure. The social contract, for Locke, establishes government as a neutral arbiter to protect these rights, not to dominate its citizens. If the government fails to uphold its end of the contract by becoming tyrannical or violating natural rights, citizens are justified in rebelling. Jean-Jacques Rousseau went further. He argued that modern society had corrupted humanity, introducing inequality and domination. The true social contract, he believed, was not about preserving self-interest, but about uniting individuals into a moral and political community. Through the general will, individuals do not lose their freedom, they gain it by participating in collective self-rule. Social contract theory has had profound influence on liberal democracy, constitutional law, and human rights. It shifted political legitimacy from divine or hereditary claims to the idea of consent and mutual obligation. But the theory also raises difficult questions. What does consent mean if we are born into a system we never chose? What happens when the state violates the contract? Who defines the terms? Despite its critiques, the social contract remains a powerful metaphor. It frames political life as something not imposed upon us, but as something we collectively shape and can renegotiate. The veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance is a philosophical device developed by political philosopher John Rawls in his seminal 1971 work, A Theory of Justice. It is designed to help us think clearly and fairly about the principles that should govern a just society. The key insight is simple but powerful. If you want to build a fair social system, you must do so without knowing your own position within it. Imagine you are behind a veil of ignorance. You have no knowledge of your age, gender, race, intelligence, religion, talents, or socio-economic status. You do not know whether you will be rich or poor, healthy or sick, privileged or marginalized. From behind this veil, you are asked to design the basic structure of society, laws, rights, economic systems, and institutions. Because you do not know who you will be when the veil is lifted, you must choose principles that are fair to everyone. Rawls argues that rational individuals under these conditions would adopt two key principles of justice. First, they would ensure equal basic liberties for all, freedom of speech, religion, and political participation, for example. Second, they would allow for social and economic inequalities only if those inequalities benefit the least advantaged. The second principle is known as the difference principle. It reflects a core idea: people will accept some inequality, but only if it improves the situation of those at the bottom. The veil of ignorance is a powerful thought experiment because it neutralizes bias. It prevents the designer from making rules that benefit their current position. A rich person, for example, might support low taxes unless they don't know whether they will still be rich tomorrow. A member of a dominant racial group might oppose anti-discrimination laws unless they consider the possibility that they might belong to a marginalized group once the veil is lifted. Critics of Rawls have raised important questions. Some argue that people behind the veil would still be risk-averse and overly conservative, leading to rigid policies. Others say that the whole setup depends on assumptions about what rational people would choose. Libertarian critics, like Robert Nozick, reject the idea that justice is a matter of distribution at all, arguing instead for inviolable individual rights. Still, the veil of ignorance endures because it shifts the focus of justice from power and privilege to fairness and empathy. It asks, would you still support your society's rules if you didn't know they would benefit you? If not, perhaps those rules need to change. The Azote problem. The Azote problem is one of the most influential challenges in moral philosophy. First clearly articulated by the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume in his 1739 work, A Treatise of Human Nature. Hume observed that many writers make a subtle but critical logical leap. They begin by describing how the world is facts about human behavior, society, or nature, and then, often without justification, conclude with how the world ought to be. This jump from descriptive statements to prescriptive ones, known as the Azote gap, forms the heart of Hume's critique. He argued that no set of factual premises, no matter how detailed, can logically entail a moral conclusion unless some normative premise is already smuggled in. You can describe 1,000 facts about how people act, what they desire, or what causes happiness, but none of these facts alone will tell you what you should do. To derive a moral ought, you need a moral principle. For example, imagine someone argues, people naturally seek pleasure, so we ought to promote pleasure. This appears reasonable, but it contains an unstated assumption that natural desires are morally authoritative. That bridge between is and ought is not self-evident. Hume's point is not to deny that moral conclusions are possible, but to insist that they require justification beyond empirical observation. This challenge has had wide-ranging consequences. In ethics, it helped distinguish between descriptive disciplines and normative ethics, which seeks to determine what is right or wrong. In science, it serves as a warning against moral naturalism, the view that moral truths can be discovered through scientific facts alone. Simply knowing how the brain reacts to suffering, or how cooperation evolves, does not by itself tell us how we should treat others. Philosophers like G.E. Moore later echoed Hume's concern in what became known as the naturalistic fallacy, the mistaken belief that you can define good solely in terms of natural properties like pleasure, survival, or efficiency. According to Moore, good is a non-reducible, indefinable property. In practical life, the Izzat problem appears when people use nature to justify ethics, such as claiming that because animals fight for dominance, human warfare is natural and therefore acceptable, or that because men and women evolved with different roles, those roles should be preserved today. Hume's insight warns us not to confuse what happens with what should happen. Ultimately, the Izzat problem is not an argument against morality, but a call for rigor. It reminds us that values do not automatically arise from facts. To justify ethical claims, we must do more than describe, we must argue. Hedonism. Hedonism is the philosophical doctrine that pleasure is the highest good and the proper aim of human life. It holds that what makes life worth living, what makes an action, choice, or existence desirable, is the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. On its surface, the idea may seem simplistic, even self-indulgent, but hedonism has a long and complex history that spans ethics, psychology, and metaphysics. The roots of hedonism stretch back to ancient Greece, most notably in the thought of Epicurus. Contrary to the modern stereotype of hedonism as mindless pleasure-seeking, Epicurus advocated for a refined and rational pursuit of pleasure. For him, the greatest pleasures were not found in indulgence, but in tranquility, ataraxia, and freedom from disturbance. Aponia, a quiet life with good friends, modest food, and philosophical reflection, brought the most lasting satisfaction. Epicurus warned against overindulgence, noting that excessive desires often lead to anxiety and pain. Another ancient proponent, Aristippus of Cyrene, took a more immediate view. He believed in maximizing present pleasures and minimizing discomfort. This version of hedonism is closer to what we associate with the term today, a pursuit of sensual and bodily enjoyment. But Aristippus, too, insisted that wise choices, self-control, and knowledge were necessary to attain real pleasure. In modern times, hedonism took on a more systematic form in utilitarianism, particularly in the work of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Bentham's version was quantitative, the more pleasure, the better. Mill refined this into a qualitative view, distinguishing between higher pleasures of the intellect and lower pleasures of the body. Mill famously wrote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied," suggesting that not all pleasures are equal. Philosophical critiques of hedonism are numerous. Some argue that pleasure is not the only good. What about knowledge, virtue, or meaning? Others point out scenarios where pleasure conflicts with morality, such as enjoying something that causes harm to others. Robert Nozick's experience machine thought experiment poses a challenge. If we could plug into a machine that simulates perfect pleasure, would we do it? Most say no, suggesting we value more than just pleasurable experience. We want authenticity, achievement, and connection to reality. Still, hedonism endures as a compelling idea because it focuses attention on what makes life worth living. Whether through fine meals, warm conversations, intellectual joy, or peace of mind, pleasure remains central to the human experience. The real debate is not whether pleasure matters, but how much it should matter, and which kinds are truly worth pursuing. Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is not an argument for the existence of God in the traditional sense. It is, rather, a decision-theoretic approach to belief, an attempt to reason what one should do when faced with uncertainty about the divine. Blaise Pascal, a 17th-century French mathematician and philosopher, formulated the wager in his posthumously published work Pensées, Thoughts. He framed the question of belief not as a matter of proof, but of prudence. His challenge is simple. In the absence of certainty, how should a rational person bet? The wager begins with an observation. Reason alone cannot prove or disprove the existence of God. The evidence is ambiguous, the arguments inconclusive, but we must still make a choice. We must either live as if God exists or as if he does not. In this unavoidable gamble, Pascal invites us to consider the consequences. If you wager that God exists and you are right, you gain eternal happiness, an infinite reward. If you are wrong, you lose little or nothing. If you wager that God does not exist and are correct, you gain a finite advantage, perhaps more personal freedom in this life. But if you are wrong, you face infinite loss, eternal separation from God. From a probabilistic standpoint, even a small chance at infinite reward outweighs any finite cost. Therefore, Pascal concludes, it is more rational to bet on God's existence than against it. Critics of Pascal's wager have raised serious objections. One of the most famous is the many gods problem. Which God are we supposed to wager on? Christianity, Islam, deism. If multiple conceptions of the divine are possible, the wager's payoff matrix becomes confused. Others argue that belief is not a switch one can flip at will. You cannot simply choose to believe in God for strategic reasons. Genuine faith does not work that way. Moreover, some see the wager as cynical. It treats faith not as a truth-seeking act, but as a form of self-interest. Pascal anticipated many of these objections. He did not view the wager as a final argument, but as a starting point, a way to awaken the indifferent, to shake them out of apathy. For Pascal, the wager was less about convincing skeptics than about urging the spiritually lukewarm to take their existential condition seriously. If you cannot know, at least act as if the stakes matter. Then, perhaps, belief will follow practice. At its core, Pascal's wager reframes religious belief as a moral risk, not a metaphysical conclusion. It asks, in the face of uncertainty, what kind of life will you live, and what are you willing to risk for the possibility that meaning is real? Cogito, ergo sum. Cogito, ergo sum. Latin for I think, therefore I am, is perhaps the most famous phrase in all of Western philosophy. It was coined by René Descartes in the 17th century as a foundational statement in his quest for certainty. Faced with the possibility that everything he believed could be an illusion, his senses, his memories, even the external world, Descartes sought a single truth that could withstand radical doubt. That truth, he argued, is the simple fact that he is thinking. And from this, his existence necessarily follows. The cogito appears in Descartes' discourse on method and is developed more rigorously in Meditations on First Philosophy. The structure of the argument is elegant and compact. Suppose a malevolent demon is deceiving you about everything, the external world, your body, even the laws of mathematics. Still, even if everything you perceive is false, the very act of doubting proves that there is a mind doing the doubting. Doubt is a form of thought, and if thinking is happening, then something, someone, must be doing it. The cogito does not prove the existence of a physical body or an external world. It does not provide a full picture of the self. It proves only that there is something thinking. For Descartes, this was enough to build a foundation for knowledge. From the certainty of the cogito, he sought to rebuild the edifice of philosophy and science, ultimately concluding, through further argument, that God must exist, and that the material world must be real. Critics have challenged the cogito on several fronts. Some argue that Descartes sneaks in the assumption of a self that I think already presupposes an I. Perhaps all we can really say is that thinking is occurring without assuming a stable, unified subject. Others question whether thought guarantees existence in the meaningful way Descartes imagined. Still, the force of the cogito lies in its resistance to doubt. It is not a syllogism, but an intuition, an immediate awareness of one's own mental activity. In modern philosophy, the cogito marks a turning point. It shifts the foundation of knowledge from the external world to the internal experience of consciousness. It anticipates later explorations of subjectivity in thinkers like Kant, Husserl, and Sartre. And it continues to serve as a reference point in debates about self-awareness, personal identity, and the nature of consciousness. More than a slogan, "I think, therefore I am," is a confrontation with the raw fact of existence. When all else is stripped away, when every belief, perception, and assumption is suspended, what remains is the bare flame of awareness, a mind encountering itself. The Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma is a challenge to the idea that morality is grounded in divine command. It appears in one of Plato's early dialogues, Euthyphro, where Socrates engages a man named Euthyphro in conversation outside an Athenian courthouse. Euthyphro claims to understand piety so well that he is prosecuting his own father for murder. Socrates, ever skeptical, presses him to define what makes something morally right. What emerges is a deceptively simple question. Is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it is good? If something is good simply because the gods command it, then morality becomes arbitrary. God could have commanded cruelty, dishonesty, or injustice, and those things would then be good, simply by fiat. This threatens to make moral values capricious, subject to divine whim, rather than grounded in reason. On the other hand, if the gods command something because it is good, then goodness must exist independently of divine will. In that case, morality is not based on God, but on some higher standard that even God must recognize. This undermines the idea that God is the ultimate source of moral authority. God becomes a kind of moral messenger, not the author of goodness. This dilemma remains a central issue in the philosophy of religion and ethics. For religious thinkers who hold that God is both omnipotent and the source of all moral truth, neither option is comfortable. If morality is independent of God, then ethics becomes autonomous, grounded in reason, human nature, or some objective standard outside of theology. If morality depends entirely on God's will, then it risks becoming arbitrary and potentially immoral. Some theologians attempt to escape the dilemma by redefining God's nature. They argue that God is not separate from goodness, but is identical to it. God's commands are not arbitrary, because they issue from his inherently good nature. This move, however, faces its own challenges. It shifts the problem rather than resolves it, and it raises further questions about what it means to say God is good, if we cannot independently evaluate goodness. Others reject the dilemma altogether, arguing that it imposes a false binary. But even so, the basic tension it identifies, between divine command and moral independence, continues to shape debates over the foundations of ethics. The Euthyphro dilemma does not simply trouble theology. It forces anyone who invokes authority, divine or otherwise, as a basis for morality to answer a fundamental question: is that authority creating morality or responding to it? The golden mean. The golden mean is a central concept in Aristotle's ethical philosophy, particularly in his Nicomachean Ethics. It is the idea that moral virtue lies between two extremes, excess and deficiency. Courage, for example, is the mean between rashness and cowardice. Generosity is the mean between wastefulness and stinginess. The virtuous life, according to Aristotle, is one of moderation, of finding balance in thought, emotion, and action. Unlike a mathematical average, the golden mean is not a fixed point. It is relative to the individual and the situation. What counts as courageous for a soldier in battle is different from what counts as courageous for a child confronting a bully. The mean is not a one-size-fits-all formula. It requires wisdom to discern what the right action is, in the right way, at the right time. Aristotle's ethics is grounded in the idea of eudaimonia, a Greek word often translated as flourishing or well-being. He believed that humans, like everything in nature, have a purpose or telos. Our unique function is rational activity. Living well, then, means living in accordance with reason and cultivating virtues through practice. These virtues, courage, temperance, justice, and others, are not innate but developed over time, like habits, and they are maintained through balance. The golden mean challenges the binary thinking that often dominates moral discussion. It suggests that extremes are typically vices, even when they seem virtuous at first glance. Too much honesty can become cruelty. Too much discipline can become rigidity. Too much confidence can become arrogance. The key is not to reject passion, ambition, or pleasure, but to regulate them, harmonize them with reason, and channel them toward noble ends. This framework contrasts sharply with rule-based ethics, like Kantian deontology, which seeks universal moral laws. Aristotle's approach is more flexible and context-sensitive. It asks not, "What rule must I follow?" but "What kind of person should I become?" Virtue, in his view, is not about isolated actions, but about character, developed through experience, education, and reflection. Critics of the golden mean argue that moderation is not always virtuous. In the face of injustice, for example, moderation can become complicity. Courage is not always in the middle. Sometimes it demands extremes. But Aristotle's defenders reply that the mean is not timidity, it is excellence. It is not about doing less, but doing better. In a world of excess and polarization, the golden mean remains a powerful model. It reminds us that the good life is not found in extremes, but in a steady, mindful balance, attuned to reason, shaped by virtue, and oriented toward human flourishing. Occam's razor. So Occam's razor is a philosophical and methodological principle that suggests, when presented with competing explanations for the same phenomenon, the simplest one is usually the best. Formulated in various forms over centuries, it is most commonly attributed to the 14th century English friar and philosopher William of Occam, though the phrase Occam's razor came later. Occam himself never put it quite so neatly, but he did write that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity, a caution against unnecessary complexity in reasoning. At its core, the razor is not a law of logic, nor a guarantee of truth. It is a heuristic, a tool for guiding thought. It tells us not to assume more than is needed. If two theories explain the data equally well, the one with fewer assumptions or fewer moving parts is generally preferred. In science, this principle underpins much of hypothesis testing and model building. Suppose you observe lights in the sky. Theory A says they are aircraft. Theory B says they are alien spacecraft that project artificial lights designed to mimic aircraft. Both might fit the data, but Theory A is simpler. It appeals to known entities and forces. Theory B invents unverified agents. Occam's razor would favor Theory A, not because it's guaranteed to be right, but because it adds less speculative baggage. Occam's razor also plays a role in metaphysics, theology, and epistemology. Philosophers use it to evaluate competing accounts of the mind, the universe, or God. Is consciousness best explained by dualism, which posits an immaterial soul, or by physicalism, which explains mental states in terms of brain processes? The razor leans toward the explanation that assumes fewer kinds of substances or unknown mechanisms. However, the principle is not infallible. Simpler does not always mean truer. Some phenomena are inherently complex. The history of science is filled with examples where the more complex theory turned out to be correct. Heliocentrism, quantum mechanics, evolutionary biology. What matters is not just simplicity, but explanatory power. A simple theory that explains little is less useful than a complex theory that explains a lot. Moreover, simplicity itself is not always easy to define. Is a theory with fewer assumptions simpler, or one that uses more familiar concepts? Does parsimony refer to the number of entities invoked, or the number of logical steps? These debates show that Occam's razor is a guide, not a rulebook. Still, its lasting value lies in its intellectual discipline. It reminds us to be cautious with our imaginations, to resist the lure of convoluted answers, and to start with what is necessary before reaching for what is extraordinary. The principle of sufficient reason. So, the principle of sufficient reason is the idea that everything must have a reason, cause, or explanation. Nothing, no event, no existence, no truth happens or exists without a sufficient reason why it is so and not otherwise. This principle underlies much of philosophical inquiry, and while it may seem like common sense, it carries profound implications for metaphysics, science, theology, and even free will. The clearest early articulation of the PSR comes from the German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in the 17th century. For Leibniz, the universe requires an explanation, why there is something rather than nothing. According to him, even truths of fact need grounding. The world, he argued, is not self-explanatory. Its existence demands a sufficient reason, which he believed must ultimately reside in God, a necessary being whose own nature provides the explanation for everything else. The PSR comes in different forms. In one version, it demands that every being has a cause or explanation. In another, that every truth has a reason why it is true. Either way, it expresses a deep human impulse, the refusal to accept brute facts. If something happens, a coin flips heads, a tree falls, a thought arises, we naturally ask why and expect some kind of answer. In science, this principle is foundational. Scientists assume the universe operates according to consistent laws, that patterns have causes, and phenomena don't just happen spontaneously without explanation. Without that assumption, scientific inquiry would be arbitrary. But the PSR also pushes beyond science. In metaphysics, it raises the question, why does the universe exist at all? If everything contingent, everything that could have been otherwise, requires explanation, then the universe, being contingent, must be grounded in something necessary. Yet the PSR is not without critics. David Hume famously doubted the necessity of causation itself, arguing that our belief in necessary connection comes from habit, not logic. Quantum physics, with its probabilistic events and apparent randomness, has led some to question whether everything really needs a cause. And existentialists, like Jean-Paul Sartre, have challenged the idea that life must have an explanation at all, embracing the absurdity of a universe without ultimate reason. Still, the PSR endures because it reflects our intellectual restlessness. We want the world to make sense, not just in its parts, but in its whole. And even if the principle is not provable, abandoning it would mean accepting that some things just happen for no reason, with no cause. Whether you find that liberating or disturbing depends on how much mystery you're willing to live with. The Gettier problem. For centuries, philosophers accepted a simple formula for knowledge. To know something is to hold a belief that is both true and justified. This triad, justified, true belief, was thought sufficient to define knowledge. But in 1963, a short paper by Edmund Gettier shattered that assumption. In just a few pages, Gettier showed that one could have a belief that is justified and true, and yet still not count as knowledge. What resulted has come to be known as the Gettier problem, a challenge that continues to unsettle epistemology. Gettier's examples are deceptively simple. Imagine a man named Smith who has strong evidence for the following proposition. Jones will get the job, and Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith has heard the hiring manager say Jones will be hired and has just counted the coins in Jones's pocket. So Smith concludes, reasonably, the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. But suppose, unknown to Smith, he himself will actually get the job, and by coincidence also has 10 coins in his own pocket. His belief is justified, and it is true, the person who gets the job does have 10 coins. But clearly, Smith didn't know that. His belief was correct by accident. What Gettier demonstrated is that justified true belief is not enough, at least not always. There is a gap between believing something for a good reason and knowing it. A belief can be true, and your justification might be sound based on what you know. But if the truth turns out to be the result of luck or coincidence, we hesitate to call it knowledge. The implications are significant. If Gettier is right, then our traditional definition of knowledge needs revision. Philosophers have since proposed various solutions. Some suggest adding a fourth condition, like no false premises or reliable belief-forming process, or non-defeasibility, meaning the justification wouldn't be undermined by further information. Others have gone further, questioning whether the entire project of defining knowledge as a formula is even workable. The Gettier problem forces a reconsideration of what it means to know. It reminds us that truth and belief, and even justification, aren't always aligned. There's something fragile, even accidental, about knowledge, something not captured by clean definitions. We trust our senses, our reasoning, our memory. But if Gettier is right, these tools don't guarantee knowledge. They get us close, but not always close enough. And in that narrow space between truth and luck lies one of philosophy's most persistent puzzles: the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is the cornerstone of Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy. Unlike rules grounded in consequences or emotions, Kant believed that true morality must be based on reason alone. The categorical imperative is his attempt to define a universal principle that can guide moral action regardless of circumstances, desires, or outcomes. At its core, the categorical imperative asks this: can the rule behind your action be made into a universal law that everyone could follow without contradiction? If the answer is no, then your action is morally impermissible, not because of what it causes, but because it fails the test of consistency and rationality. Take lying, for example. Suppose you lie to borrow money you don't intend to repay. The rule behind your action would be something like, it's okay to lie to get money. But if everyone followed that rule, trust would collapse. Promises would become meaningless. No one would lend money at all. The rule undermines itself. It's self-defeating when universalized. Therefore, lying in that case is immoral. Kant contrasted the categorical imperative with what he called hypothetical imperatives, rules that apply only if you want a certain result. For example, if you want to be healthy, you should exercise. These are conditional. But moral duties, Kant argued, must be unconditional. They must apply to all rational beings, in all situations. That's why they are categorical. They command absolutely. Kant formulated the categorical imperative in several ways. The first is the universal law test mentioned above. The second is the humanity formula, which says, always treat humanity in yourself and in others as an end in itself, never merely as a means. This version focuses on dignity and respect. People are not tools or instruments. You cannot use someone, deceive them, exploit them, manipulate them, without violating their inherent moral worth. This second formulation captures the intuition behind many of our ethical judgments. Why is coercion wrong? Because it treats the person as a means. Why is consent so important? Because it recognizes the other as an end. The categorical imperative in both formulations demands consistency, respect, and rational universality. Critics of Kant argue that his system is too rigid, that it lacks room for compassion, context, or emotional nuance. What if lying saves a life? What if telling the truth causes harm? Kant remained firm. Morality must be based on principles, not outcomes. Still, the categorical imperative endures, because it offers a powerful idea that morality is not about what we want, but about what we can will for everyone. It is a call to integrity, to reason, and to respect for persons as moral equals. The mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is one of the oldest and most persistent questions in philosophy. What is the relationship between the mental and the physical? How does the conscious experience of thought, emotion, perception, and desire relate to the physical brain, the body, and the material world? The problem arises because human beings seem to be composed of two radically different kinds of stuff. On one hand, there is the physical body made of cells, tissues, neurons, and governed by the laws of physics. On the other, there is the mind, consciousness, awareness, inner life. We feel pain, we imagine, we reason, we reflect. These mental states have subjective qualities. They are experienced from the inside. The body can be studied publicly. The mind is accessible only to the individual. René Descartes famously articulated this dualism in the 17th century, proposing that the mind is a non-material substance, a res cogitans, distinct from the body, which is a res extensa. According to Descartes, the mind and body interact, but are fundamentally different in nature. This Cartesian dualism influenced generations of thinkers, but it also left a major puzzle. If mind and body are separate substances, how do they interact? How does an immaterial thought cause a hand to move? This question haunts dualism. Critics argue that it violates the principle of causal closure in physics. If every physical event has a physical cause, then where does the mental fit in? If the mind can change the body, does it override the laws of physics? In response, many philosophers have turned to physicalism or materialism, the view that everything about the mind can ultimately be explained in physical terms. The brain, under this view, is the mind. Mental states are brain states. Consciousness is an emergent property of neural activity, but this too raises questions. How do electrochemical signals produce subjective experience? Why should a particular pattern of neurons firing feel like the taste of cinnamon, the color red, or the grief of loss? This is the hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers calls it. Explaining behavior or function is one thing. Explaining experience is another. Why does it feel like something to be alive, to think, to suffer? Other theories have emerged. Some propose identity theory. Mental states are brain states. Others prefer functionalism. The mind is defined by what it does, not what it is. Some philosophers explore panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of all matter, and others pursue eliminative materialism, which argues that our current understanding of the mind is wrong in the same way pre-modern theories of heat or disease were wrong. The mind-body problem remains unsolved, but it continues to press on the deepest questions of selfhood, consciousness, and what it means to be human. It is not merely a scientific or metaphysical puzzle, it's the question behind every moment you feel, think, remember, or wonder. Akrasia. Akrasia is the phenomenon of acting against one's better judgment, knowing what you ought to do, and yet failing to do it. The term comes from ancient Greek, literally meaning lack of power or lack of command. It's what happens when you stay up late, scrolling despite knowing you'll regret it, or when you break a diet despite sincerely intending not to. The problem of akrasia puzzled the ancient philosophers. Socrates, in Plato's Protagoras, famously denied that akrasia exists. He argued that no one willingly chooses what they believe to be worse. If someone acts badly, it must be due to ignorance, either of what is good or of how to get it. For Socrates, all wrongdoing is a failure of knowledge. To truly know the good is to do the good. But Aristotle disagreed. In Nicomachean Ethics, he argued that akrasia is real. People often act in ways that contradict their rational understanding. They may know what is right in the abstract, yet fail to act on it in the moment. Aristotle saw akrasia as a conflict between reason and appetite. The acratic person is not ignorant of what is best, but their desires override their judgment at a critical moment. They are weak, not intellectually, but morally. This insight has had a long afterlife. In modern philosophy, akrasia is sometimes called weakness of will, and it's been studied through the lenses of ethics, psychology, and cognitive science. One of the puzzles it raises is how it's even logically possible. If you believe that X is the best action available, how can you knowingly choose not X? Doesn't choosing imply that you believe it's best? Some philosophers propose that belief is not enough. You may believe that quitting smoking is good, but lack the desire strong enough to act on it. Others suggest that we are often of two minds. We might hold conflicting beliefs simultaneously or have temporary lapses where impulse overrides reflective thought. In recent decades, the concept of akrasia has expanded into discussions about procrastination, addiction, self-control, and personal autonomy. Behavioral economists talk about hyperbolic discounting, our tendency to choose immediate rewards over larger future ones, even when we know better. Philosophers of mind explore the fragmentation of the self. Perhaps you who stays up late is not exactly the same you who made plans in the morning. Akrasia cuts to the heart of human struggle. We are not always rational agents. We are creatures of habit, emotion, and contradiction. Understanding akrasia isn't just an abstract exercise, it's a mirror. It reveals how often we sabotage ourselves and how difficult it is to live up to our own ideals. Dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is the philosophical framework underpinning Marxist theory. It merges two key ideas: materialism, the belief that matter, not mind or spirit, is the fundamental substance of reality, and dialectics, the view that progress and change result from the clash of opposing forces. Together, they form a method for understanding history, politics, society, and even human consciousness. To grasp dialectical materialism, start with materialism. Unlike idealism, which treats ideas or consciousness as the foundation of reality, materialism insists that the material conditions of life, economic production, class relations, labor, and property, shape human experience. For Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, it was not human thought that drives history, but the conditions in which people struggle to survive and meet their needs. But Marx didn't adopt a static materialism. Influenced by Hegel's dialectics, he saw history as dynamic. In Hegel's version, dialectics unfolds through a triadic process: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Marx accepted this structure, but flipped its content. Instead of ideas driving history, he argued that material conflicts, especially between classes, drive historical development. For example, feudalism produced a landowning aristocracy and a dependent peasantry. Over time, contradictions within that system, economic stagnation, social unrest, gave rise to capitalism, which brought new productive forces and a new contradiction: the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. The struggle between these classes becomes the engine of historical change, pushing toward a future socialist society. Dialectical materialism is not just a theory of history, it's a method for analyzing reality. It rejects metaphysical absolutes and static categories. Instead, it emphasizes process, contradiction, interconnection, and transformation. Everything, institutions, beliefs, technologies, is in motion, shaped by internal tensions and conflicts. Social structures don't just evolve, they are overturned when their contradictions reach breaking points. Critics have challenged dialectical materialism on many fronts. Some see it as overly deterministic, reducing human agency to economic forces. Others argue that history is messier than Marx's linear schema suggests, and in practice, attempts to apply dialectical materialism, especially in authoritarian regimes, have often led to dogmatism rather than flexible analysis. Yet the appeal of dialectical materialism endures. It offers a lens to see beyond surface-level appearances. Why do societies change? Why do revolutions erupt? Why do certain ideas dominate? The answer, Marx argued, lies not in philosophy alone, but in the material lives of people and the contradictions that shape them. The experience machine. The experience machine is a thought experiment introduced by philosopher Robert Nozick in his 1974 book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. It challenges a foundational assumption of utilitarianism that pleasure or happiness is the highest good. Nozick's machine poses a direct question. If we could experience perfect pleasure and happiness artificially, would we choose it? Imagine a machine that can simulate any experience you desire. You could feel like you're writing a great novel, climbing Mount Everest, falling in love, raising a family, anything. The machine feeds your brain flawless electrical impulses to make these experiences feel completely real. Once plugged in, you won't know you're in a simulation. It will feel just like life. But it isn't life. It's a program. You won't actually be doing those things. You'll just think you are. Nozick asks, would you plug in? Many people hesitate. Some outright refuse. That reaction is the core of his argument. If we cared only about how life feels from the inside, we'd have no reason not to plug in. But most of us want more than pleasant experiences. We want to do things, not just feel like we're doing them. We want our actions to matter, to be grounded in reality. We want agency, authenticity, even if it comes with suffering or failure. Nozick concludes that pleasure is not the only thing we value. We care about truth. We care about actually being someone, not just believing we are. The experience machine, by offering perfect illusion, exposes the limits of hedonism and utilitarian thinking. This thought experiment continues to provoke debate. Some argue that Nozick underestimates how powerful pleasure is, or that fear of the unknown distorts our moral intuitions. Others point out that people often do seek escape through drugs, video games, virtual reality, or even fantasy to avoid pain. Maybe the line between real and simulated experience isn't so rigid. Still, the experiment resonates. It forces us to confront deep questions. What do we value in life? Is it enough to feel good? Or do we need our experiences to be anchored in something real, even if that real world is difficult, painful, and beyond our control? The experience machine isn't just about philosophy. It's about your life. What matters more, how things feel, or how things truly are? Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is one of the most influential ethical theories in modern philosophy. At its core lies a deceptively simple principle. The right action is the one that maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering. The consequences of our actions, not our intentions, duties, or rules, are what ultimately determine their moral worth. This idea was developed in the 18th and 19th centuries by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Bentham, the more radical of the two, introduced the concept of the hedonic calculus, a theoretical method for weighing the pleasure and pain produced by different actions. For Bentham, all pleasures and pains counted equally. The only thing that mattered was the net balance. Use koini wuncherak buradu. The Setubas and Bansef de Centuries Pushpin is as good as poetry, he wrote, suggesting that pleasure's source was irrelevant, only its quantity mattered. Mill refined the theory. He argued that some pleasures are qualitatively superior to others. The pleasures of the intellect, imagination, and moral sentiment, he believed, are more valuable than mere physical gratification. According to Mill, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, because human pleasures engage our higher faculties and express our full nature. Utilitarianism is appealing for its clarity and its democratic spirit. It treats each person's happiness as equally important. It cuts through rigid moral codes and asks a pragmatic question: what will actually make the world better? In this sense, utilitarianism underpins many modern institutions: cost-benefit analysis, public policy, healthcare triage, and economic ethics all rely on versions of its logic. But utilitarianism has serious challenges. Critics argue that by focusing solely on outcomes, it can justify morally troubling actions. If torturing one person would prevent the suffering of many, does the math make it right? Utilitarianism can seem blind to individual rights, justice, or fairness. It may sacrifice the few for the sake of the many, without acknowledging the moral cost. Another problem is uncertainty. We rarely know the full consequences of our actions. Trying to calculate long-term effects can be speculative and imprecise. What seems beneficial now may turn harmful later. Despite these issues, utilitarianism remains a powerful ethical tool. It reminds us to look beyond ourselves. It forces us to weigh the impact of our choices. And it asks us, relentlessly, to care, not just about what we believe or intend, but about what actually happens to real people in the world. Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno of Elea, a Greek philosopher from the 5th century BCE, is remembered almost entirely for his paradoxes. Strange and subtle arguments that challenge our basic understanding of motion, space, and time. At first glance, his paradoxes seem absurd or easily refutable. But the more carefully one examines them, the more they expose unsettling flaws in how we assume the world works. Zeno's most famous paradox is called Achilles and the tortoise. Suppose Achilles gives a tortoise a small head start in a race. Achilles runs faster, but by the time he reaches the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise has moved forward a bit. By the time Achilles reaches that point, the tortoise has moved forward again, and so on, forever. Zeno argues that Achilles will never catch the tortoise because there are infinitely many points he must reach, and he must reach each one before overtaking the tortoise. How then can motion even happen? A related puzzle is the dichotomy paradox. To walk across a room, you must first go halfway. But before you get halfway, you must go a quarter of the way. Before that, an eighth, and so on. The journey seems to require completing an infinite number of smaller steps. If each step takes time, and there are infinitely many of them, how can you ever reach the other side? Then there's the arrow paradox, which claims that an arrow in flight is at every instant of time, not moving. At any given moment, it occupies a specific location in space. Since motion requires change, and there is no change in any frozen instant, motion must be an illusion, just a sequence of still positions, like frames in a film. Zeno wasn't trying to disprove motion outright. Rather, he was a student of Parmenides, who believed that change and multiplicity were illusions, and that true reality is one, unchanging, and eternal. Zeno's paradoxes were designed to support this radical metaphysical view by revealing contradictions in our everyday assumptions. Modern mathematics and physics have addressed many of Zeno's arguments. The development of calculus showed how an infinite number of steps can sum to a finite result, allowing Achilles to overtake the tortoise. Time and motion are now understood through limits, convergence, and continuous functions. But Zeno's challenge endures, not because it proves motion is impossible, but because it reveals how difficult it is to explain something as seemingly simple as moving from point A to point B. Zeno reminds us that the obvious can be deceptive, and that real understanding often begins with a puzzle. The anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is a philosophical reflection on one of the most perplexing facts in cosmology. The universe appears to be extraordinarily fine-tuned for the emergence of life, specifically for human life. From the strength of gravity to the mass of the electron, From the expansion rate of the universe to the balance of nuclear forces, dozens of physical constants sit within a narrow range. If they were even slightly different, life as we know it would not be possible. Why? The anthropic principle attempts to answer that question, but it does so in a peculiar way. At its most basic, the principle simply states the universe must have properties that allow observers like us to exist, or else we wouldn't be here to notice them. This is the weak anthropic principle. It's not a causal explanation, it's a selection effect. We shouldn't be surprised the universe supports life, because only a universe that supports life could contain beings capable of asking the question. The strong anthropic principle goes further. It claims that the universe must have properties that allow for conscious observers to arise at some stage. This version flirts with teleology. It suggests the universe is in some sense structured, or meant, to produce intelligent life. That implication makes many scientists and philosophers uneasy. Is the universe designed for us, or are we merely reading intention into an indifferent system? The anthropic principle has been used to support a variety of theories. Some invoke the multiverse hypothesis. If there are countless universes, each with different physical laws, then it's not surprising that at least one of them happens to support life. We just happen to be in the one where we can exist. This turns the fine-tuning problem into a kind of cosmic lottery. Others argue that the principle explains nothing. It merely restates the fact that we exist in a universe where existence is possible. It doesn't tell us why the laws are what they are, only that if they were different, we wouldn't be here. Still, the anthropic principle raises unsettling questions. Does the universe care that we are here? Is life a fluke or a necessity? Are we special, or just an accidental byproduct of physics? At its core, the principle confronts us with the strange harmony between consciousness and cosmos. Whether it's profound or tautological depends on what we expect from an explanation. But either way, the question remains. Why is the universe so precisely set up for minds capable of asking why? The liar paradox. The liar paradox is one of the oldest and most enduring problems in logic. Its classic form is simple. This sentence is false. If the sentence is true, then what it says must hold, but it says that it is false. So if it's true, then it's false. But if it's false, then it's not false. It must be true. The statement seems to loop back on itself endlessly, breaking our basic understanding of truth and falsity. Versions of this paradox go back to antiquity. The Greek philosopher Eubulides is credited with first formulating it in the 4th century BCE. Since then, it has haunted logicians, philosophers, and linguists alike. It is not merely a linguistic trick. It reveals something deeply problematic about how we handle self-reference in language and logic. The liar paradox isn't just a party riddle. It exposes a foundational weakness in classical logic, which assumes that every meaningful proposition must be either true or false, never both, never neither. But the liar sentence challenges this binary. It is logically coherent, grammatically correct, and clearly understandable, yet it breaks the system that's supposed to classify it. One reaction is to deny that the sentence is genuinely meaningful. Perhaps it's syntactically correct, but semantically empty, a verbal illusion, like a mirage. Others suggest that natural languages are simply too sloppy and imprecise for such edge cases, and that a stricter logical language could avoid the problem. More ambitious approaches come from formal logic. The logician Alfred Tarski argued that a language cannot consistently contain its own truth predicate. That is, a sentence in a language should not be able to make claims about truth within that same language. To avoid paradox, we need a hierarchy of languages. A sentence in one object language can only be called true or false by a separate meta-language positioned above it. But this doesn't entirely resolve the philosophical discomfort. It merely fences the problem off. Later developments in logic, like paraconsistent and non-classical logics, attempt to allow for contradictions without collapsing into incoherence. These systems are controversial, but they reflect a growing willingness to challenge traditional principles in order to handle paradox. At its heart, the liar paradox forces us to ask, what is truth? What are the limits of language? Can all statements be nailed down as either true or false? Or must we admit that some meanings resist such categorization? In questioning the foundation of how we describe reality, the liar paradox holds a mirror to the very tools we use to think. The problem of induction. The problem of induction is a fundamental challenge in epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. It asks, how can we justify beliefs about the future based on observations of the past? Introduced most famously by the Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century, this problem strikes at the very core of how science, reasoning, and daily life function. Consider a simple example. You've seen the sun rise every morning of your life. You reasonably believe it will rise tomorrow. But what justifies this belief? You might say, because it always has. But that's not an argument. It's a pattern. The belief that the future will resemble the past is not logically guaranteed. It's a habit of expectation, not a necessity of reason. Hume's key insight was this: all inductive reasoning assumes that nature is uniform, that the future will be like the past. But that assumption itself cannot be proved by induction without falling into circular logic. You can't justify induction by using induction. That would be like arguing. Induction works because it has worked before. This might sound abstract, but the consequences are profound. Science, after all, is based on inductive reasoning. We conduct experiments, observe regularities, and propose general laws. But according to Hume, these are never logically certain, they're just highly probable. The problem of induction reveals that even our most trusted knowledge rests on a fragile foundation. Philosophers have proposed various responses. Some try to justify induction pragmatically. It may not be logically infallible, but it works. Science delivers technology, medicine, and understanding, so we trust the method. Others appeal to probability theory or Bayesian reasoning to frame inductive inference in terms of degrees of belief. These don't solve the logical problem, but they make induction more coherent and manageable. Karl Popper offered a radical alternative: science should avoid induction altogether. Instead, he emphasized falsification. We don't confirm theories by accumulating observations. We try to refute them. A good scientific theory is one that can in principle be proven wrong. This shift doesn't resolve Hume's concern, but tries to sidestep it. Still, the problem remains. Every time you assume your car will start, your food won't poison you, or the sky won't fall, you are trusting induction. You're betting that the world will keep operating as it has. Hume's unsettling conclusion is that this belief is not rationally justified. It is simply human. Falsificationism. Falsificationism is a philosophy of science developed by Karl Popper in the 20th century, and it stands in direct response to the problem of induction. Where David Hume exposed the fragility of deriving universal truths from repeated observations, Popper offered a different approach. Instead of trying to prove theories true, we should aim to prove them false. At the heart of falsificationism lies a simple idea: scientific theories can never be conclusively verified by data, but they can be falsified by a single counterexample. No matter how many white swans you observe, you cannot be certain that all swans are white. But one black swan is enough to disprove the universal claim. This, Popper argued, is the distinguishing feature of scientific theories. They are testable in ways that could show them to be false. For Popper, the demarcation between science and pseudoscience depends not on whether a theory is confirmed by evidence, but whether it exposes itself to risk. If a theory cannot be tested in a way that might disprove it, then it doesn't belong to science. Astrology. Freudian psychoanalysis, and Marxist historical materialism, according to Popper, all failed this test. They could always explain away inconvenient evidence, bending to fit the data rather than risking contradiction. Falsificationism transformed the philosophy of science. It encouraged scientists to frame hypotheses that make bold predictions, statements that could in principle be shown wrong. The strength of a theory lies not in how often it's confirmed, but in how much it dares to expose itself to falsification and still survives. But falsification is not without its critics. Thomas Kuhn and others pointed out that in practice, scientists don't immediately abandon a theory when it clashes with data. Instead, they question the experiment, the equipment, or the assumptions around the test. Scientific paradigms often resist falsification until a better theory replaces them. Moreover, some theories aren't falsifiable in isolation, but only when embedded in broader frameworks. Still, Popper's core insight holds weight. Falsifiability is a check against dogma. It keeps science grounded in reality by demanding that theories be accountable to evidence. It teaches us that no theory is sacred, that knowledge advances not by accumulation alone, but by elimination, by showing what does not work. Falsificationism is not a perfect solution to Hume's problem, but it reorients scientific reasoning. It shifts the focus from confirmation to critical testing, from comfort to challenge. The butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is a concept from chaos theory, but its philosophical implications reach far beyond mathematics or meteorology. The idea is this. In a complex system, such as the weather, a tiny change in initial conditions can lead to dramatically different outcomes. The metaphor often used is that the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil might set off a tornado in Texas. The origin of the concept lies in the work of meteorologist Edward Lorenz in the 1960s. He was running computer simulations of weather patterns and discovered that a minute rounding difference, a number inputted as 0.506 instead of 0.506127, produced entirely different long-term forecasts. This wasn't just noise. It revealed that deterministic systems could behave unpredictably due to their sensitivity to initial conditions. Philosophically, the butterfly effect challenges the assumption that the world is either random or orderly in a linear, predictable way. It suggests a third possibility, determinism without predictability. The system may be governed by laws, but because we can never measure initial conditions with perfect precision, we cannot foresee the outcomes. Order gives rise to apparent chaos. In ethics, this becomes a troubling problem. If small actions can lead to enormous consequences, how do we evaluate moral responsibility? A seemingly trivial decision today might snowball into significant outcomes decades later, good or bad. But because we can't predict these long chains of consequence, our moral calculus becomes unstable. It complicates utilitarian reasoning, which depends on being able to assess future outcomes. In metaphysics, the butterfly effect feeds into questions about causality. If every effect has a cause, and those causes are infinitely branching and interdependent, then the world is a tangled web of interactions too intricate to disentangle. It undermines the notion that we can isolate variables, simplify reality, or cleanly identify singular causes. The butterfly effect also resonates with existential themes. It reminds us that our actions matter in ways we can never fully understand. Every choice sends ripples through time and space. There's both humility and gravity in that realization. Humility, because we cannot control outcomes. Gravity, because even our smallest acts may echo. Ultimately, the butterfly effect is not just a scientific principle. It's a philosophical challenge to our desire for control, prediction, and certainty. It forces us to accept complexity, to live with unpredictability, and to act responsibly even when the consequences of our choices remain hidden. The Sorite's paradox. The Sorite's paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, returns for a deeper look. not because it is obscure, but because its implications stretch into every domain where we deal with vague boundaries. The basic form of the paradox is deceptively simple. If one grain of sand does not make a heap, and adding a single grain never turns a non-heap into a heap, then how can any collection of grains become a heap at all? We explored this earlier as a puzzle of logic and language, but this second encounter invites us to confront what the paradox reveals about vagueness, categories, and the often arbitrary lines we draw in thought, in law, ethics, medicine, and identity. How do we define when something changes category? At what point does a fetus become a person? When does someone become rich, or bald, or old? These questions don't have crisp answers, because the categories themselves are built on fuzzy boundaries. The Sorite's paradox shows how our use of language stumbles over continuous change. Attempts to resolve it often focus on semantics. One approach is the epistemic view, which says there really is a precise cutoff point. We just don't know where it is. Another is supervaluationism, which holds that a vague term is true if it's true under all precisifications, and false if it's false under all of them. Still another is fuzzy logic, which allows truth to exist in degrees. In this view, someone might be 0.3 bald or 0.8 rich. The boundary becomes a gradient, not a switch. But no matter which solution we adopt, the paradox keeps haunting us. It suggests something uncomfortable, that many of our classifications are not reflections of hard truths in the world, but artifacts of our need to organize a continuous shifting reality into neat conceptual boxes. The Sorite's forces us to reconsider how we draw lines, not just in philosophy, but in everyday life. How do we decide when love turns into indifference, when discipline becomes cruelty, when tolerance becomes indifference? This paradox does not merely trap us in linguistic confusion. It confronts us with ambiguity at the heart of our moral, personal, and political judgments. And once seen, that ambiguity never fully disappears. To live wisely in light of the Sorites is not to demand impossible precision, but to develop a tolerance for the gray zones of life, to remain alert to how we define, how we label, and how we choose to navigate between extremes. The lottery paradox. The lottery paradox is a puzzle about belief, probability, and rationality. At its heart lies a tension between two things we often take for granted: that it's rational to believe what is highly probable, and that it's irrational to hold contradictory beliefs. The paradox shows that these two commitments can conflict even in simple, everyday situations. Imagine a fair lottery with 1,000 tickets and exactly one winner. For any individual ticket, the chance of winning is 1 in 1,000. That's a 99.9% chance of losing. It seems rational to believe that ticket hash 1 will lose, and also ticket hash 2, and ticket hash 3. In fact, it seems rational to believe that every individual ticket will lose. But if you believe that, then you're committed to believing that no ticket will win. And that's clearly false. Because we know one ticket must win, so you end up with a set of beliefs, each one individually rational, that together form an irrational whole. You believe of every ticket that it will lose. But you also believe the lottery must produce a winner. This is the paradox. The problem doesn't arise from faulty math. It arises from the way we manage beliefs under uncertainty. The paradox forces us to confront a troubling question. Is it always rational to believe something just because it's very likely to be true? Some philosophers propose restricting the rule. Maybe it's only rational to believe high-probability claims when they don't lead to contradiction. Others argue for loosening our standards. Perhaps it's okay to hold inconsistent beliefs, as long as they're each individually justified. Still others turn to probability logic, which treats belief not as binary, but as a matter of degrees. The lottery paradox has implications far beyond gambling. It touches science, law, and everyday reasoning. In a court of law, we may believe that the evidence makes it 99.9% likely that someone is guilty. But are we justified in convicting them on that basis alone? In scientific theory, we may believe a hypothesis is almost certainly true, but should we treat it as knowledge? Ultimately, the paradox reveals a gap between what we think we know, what we're willing to bet on, and what we can logically assert as true. It reminds us that probability and belief, though deeply intertwined, don't always move in lockstep. The lottery paradox doesn't undermine reason, but it warns us not to assume that high confidence equals certainty. Rational belief is more complex and more fragile than it first appears. Burden's ass. Burden's ass is a thought experiment designed to highlight a paradox in decision-making and rationality. It involves a simple creature, a donkey, that finds itself placed exactly midway between two identical bales of hay. Each is equally appealing, equally distant, and equally nourishing. According to strict rationality, the donkey should choose the option with better justification. But since both choices are perfectly equal, there's no rational basis to pick one over the other. So the donkey, faced with no compelling reason to lean left or right, starves to death. This image, often attributed to the 14th century French philosopher Jean Burdin, is intentionally absurd. No real donkey would behave this way. But the thought experiment isn't about donkeys. It's about what happens when a purely rational agent lacks a reason to choose at all. The paradox strikes at the heart of how we think about rational choice. If rationality demands justification for action, then in situations of perfect symmetry, action becomes impossible. And yet, we act. People make choices every day between near-identical options, brands of toothpaste, job offers, routes to work, even without strong reasons. Human beings can choose arbitrarily, but a strictly rational machine, in theory, could become paralyzed. Burden's ass illustrates the limits of rational decision-making models, especially in fields like ethics, economics, and artificial intelligence. In ethics, it raises questions about moral decision-making under uncertainty. In AI, it exposes the potential problem of designing systems that cannot act without a rational preference, no matter how small. Some philosophers respond by pointing out that the paradox assumes a flawed model of choice. In real life, small differences, psychological, contextual, subconscious, almost always tip the balance. Even when we believe options are identical, we might have micro-preferences that escape formal reasoning. Others argue that decision-making does not always require justification. A truly rational agent might adopt a randomizing principle, such as flipping a coin, to avoid paralysis in symmetrical situations. That, too, can be a kind of rationality, meta-rationality, where the goal is not perfect justification, but timely action. Burden's ass is not merely a quirky hypothetical. It asks a profound question: is pure reason enough to guide action, or does effective choice also require something beyond logic, instinct, spontaneity, will? In the end, the starving donkey reminds us that while reason is essential, it may not be sufficient. Sometimes to live, we must be willing to act, even when we can't explain exactly why. Metaethics. Metaethics is not about deciding what is right or wrong, nor is it about building systems of moral rules. Instead, it steps back and asks, what does right even mean? What are we really saying when we claim something is good, just, or morally wrong? Are these statements describing facts? Are they expressing feelings? Are they commands, preferences, or something else entirely? At its core, metaethics is the philosophy of ethical language, moral epistemology, and moral ontology. It examines not just our moral judgments, but the nature and justification of those judgments. One central debate in metaethics is between moral realism and anti-realism. Moral realists hold that moral facts exist independently of us. Just as it is true that the Earth orbits the Sun, it may be true, independently of anyone's opinion, that murder is wrong. Anti-realists, on the other hand, argue that moral judgments do not report objective facts, but reflect subjective states, social conventions, or cultural practices. Within anti-realism, emotivism claims that moral statements are expressions of emotion. When someone says stealing is wrong, they are not stating a fact, but expressing disapproval, like saying boo to stealing. Prescriptivism, by contrast, sees moral claims as imperatives. Saying stealing is wrong is like saying don't steal, a universal recommendation rather than a factual assertion. Another key question is whether morality is cognitivist or non-cognitivist. Cognitivists believe moral statements can be true or false. Non-cognitivists believe moral language doesn't express propositions, but attitudes or commands. This distinction shapes how we view moral disagreement. Are we arguing over facts or clashing emotional expressions? Metaethics also explores the source of moral knowledge. Moral intuitionism holds that we have a kind of innate moral sense that lets us perceive moral truths. Others argue for moral constructivism, where moral truths are created through rational agreement, not discovered. Finally, there's the issue of motivational internalism. Does believing something is morally right automatically motivate you to do it? Or can someone recognize that something is right and yet feel no motivation to act accordingly? These questions may seem abstract, but they underlie all ethical reasoning. When we debate policies, rights, or justice, we're often making assumptions about the nature of morality itself. Is it objective or invented, universal or local, emotion or fact? Metaethics doesn't tell us what to do, but it reveals the ground we're standing on when we try to decide. The argument from illusion. The argument from illusion is a classic challenge in the philosophy of perception. It begins with a simple observation. Our senses can deceive us. A stick half submerged in water appears bent. A distant mountain may seem blue. A mirage in the desert looks like a pool of water. From such examples, the argument unfolds. If our senses sometimes mislead us, how can we ever be certain that they reveal the world as it truly is? At the heart of this argument lies the distinction between appearance and reality. We often believe that what we see, hear, or touch gives us direct access to the external world, but illusions show us that perception is not infallible. If a straight stick can appear bent under certain conditions, then what we perceive is not always what is. Philosophers like George Berkeley and David Hume took this further. If perception is mediated by our senses, and those senses can generate illusions, then all we ever have access to are our sense data, not the world itself. We do not perceive objects directly, but instead experience mental representations of them. This position is known as indirect realism or representationalism. The implications are unsettling. If all our knowledge of the world comes through potentially unreliable sensory input, then certainty about the external world becomes difficult, if not impossible. What if everything we perceive is in some way distorted? Could we be living in a perpetual illusion? Some thinkers, like René Descartes, use the argument from illusion to fuel radical skepticism. If senses deceive us even once, he argued, we cannot trust them at all. This led him to search for a foundation of knowledge immune to doubt, culminating in his famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." Critics of the argument from illusion point out that identifying an illusion presupposes some standard of correctness. We only say the stick looks bent because we know through other means that it is straight. Thus, rather than undermining perception, illusions may reinforce it by demonstrating the interplay of perception and knowledge. Nevertheless, the argument from illusion remains a powerful reminder that our senses are fallible tools. It pushes us to ask, what is the nature of perception? Do we see the world as it is, or as our minds interpret it? And if our access to reality is always mediated, what kind of knowledge is possible? The open question argument. The open question argument, developed by British philosopher G.E. Moore in his 1903 work, Principia Ethica, is a sharp critique of ethical naturalism. The view that moral terms like good can be defined in purely naturalistic or empirical terms, such as pleasurable, desired, or conducive to survival. Moore's argument is deceptively simple but deeply influential. It asks, even if we define good as pleasurable, isn't it always a meaningful question to ask? But is pleasure good? In other words, suppose someone says, to be good is to maximize pleasure. Moore responds, that may be your definition, but can you sincerely ask whether pleasure is good? If the answer is yes, if it's still a sensible open question, then your definition must be wrong. You haven't captured the full meaning of good, because you've left room to doubt or disagree. Moore argues that truly synonymous terms cannot generate open questions. For example, once we know that bachelor means unmarried man, it makes no sense to ask, is every bachelor an unmarried man? That question is closed. But is everything pleasurable good? Remains open to real debate. That openness reveals that the moral concept good is not analytically reducible to any natural property. This leads to what Moore called the naturalistic fallacy, the error of trying to define moral terms in non-moral empirical terms. According to Moore, moral properties like goodness are simple and non-natural. They can't be broken down into observable traits. We may observe acts of kindness or outcomes of pleasure, but we don't see goodness in the same way. We intuit it, much as we might intuit color or shape without being able to explain it further. The open question argument reshaped 20th century moral philosophy. It drove a wedge between ethical language and empirical science, and it made philosophers more cautious about reducing moral claims to biology, psychology, or economics. Even today, when someone claims X is good because it's natural, or Y is right because it increases happiness, the open question argument lingers in the background, challenging that reduction. But the argument is not without critics. Some philosophers question whether moral concepts are as irreducible as Moore believed. Others argue that the openness of a question doesn't necessarily disprove its answer. After all, people often debate whether water is hatho aso, even though it is, so maybe open questions aren't always diagnostic. Still, Moore's insight remains powerful. Language resists simplification, meaning slips through definitions. And when it comes to ethics, the question, what is good, remains not only open, but essential. Death of the author. The phrase death of the author doesn't refer to the literal end of a writer's life, but to a powerful idea in literary theory that an author's personal intentions, biography, or identity should not dictate the meaning of their work. First articulated by French theorist Roland Barthes in a 1967 essay of the same name, this idea challenged centuries of traditional literary criticism that treated the author as the final authority on a text's meaning. Barthes argued that writing is not a transmission of a single fixed meaning from author to reader. Instead, it is a site of language, culture, and interpretation. The moment a text is created, it escapes the control of its author. It enters the public world of readers, all of whom bring their own ideas, associations, and assumptions. To insist on the author's intent, Barthes claimed, is to close the text, to reduce its potential meanings to just one. The essay's most famous line states, "The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." This isn't nihilism, it's liberation. It means that meaning isn't found by uncovering what the author meant, but by exploring how the reader interprets and engages with the text. A poem can evoke grief, nostalgia, or joy, depending on the reader's context, even if the author intended something entirely different. This idea transformed literary theory, giving rise to schools of thought like structuralism, post-structuralism, and reader response criticism. It also spread beyond literature to visual art, film, and even philosophy. It questioned authority, destabilized tradition, and championed plurality over dogma. But the death of the author has critics. Some argue it denies the real human voice behind the work. Others say it leads to chaotic or relativistic interpretation. If all readings are valid, can anything be wrong? And in some political contexts, knowing an author's identity, race, gender, background, can add essential layers of meaning that shouldn't be dismissed. Still, the core insight remains. Meaning is not a fossil to be dug up from the author's mind. It is a living, evolving interaction between text and reader. Once a story is told, it no longer belongs to its creator. It belongs to language, to us. And in that sense, the death of the author is not an erasure, but a passing of the torch. Identity of indiscernibles. The identity of indiscernibles is a principle in metaphysics that seems, at first, almost self-evident. If two objects are completely indistinguishable in every respect, if they share all the same properties, then they are not two objects at all, but one and the same thing. Formulated most famously by German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, this principle pushes us to confront the very nature of what it means for something to be identical. Here's how it works. Suppose you have two spheres in a universe. They are exactly the same size, mass, color, temperature, everything. If there is no property, internal or relational, that distinguishes one from the other, then according to Leibniz, they are not truly two objects. They are one. This principle becomes clearer when flipped into its logical form. If A and B are distinct, then there must be at least one property that A has which B lacks, or vice versa. In other words, distinction requires difference. On a practical level, this seems intuitive. We distinguish people, chairs, stars, and ideas by their qualities. But at a deeper level, the principle opens complex debates, especially in the realm of physics and identity theory. Can there be truly distinct, but completely indiscernible particles? In quantum mechanics, elementary particles like electrons are said to be completely indistinguishable. No intrinsic differences exist between one electron and another. Does that violate Leibniz's principle, or does it show that particles aren't truly individuals in the way we normally imagine? Some philosophers challenge the principle by imagining symmetrical universes, where two identical objects exist in mirrored positions, but have no distinguishable features aside from spatial location. In these hypothetical worlds, it seems possible to have two things that are entirely indiscernible, except by their position in space. If spatial location is not considered an internal property, this could be a counterexample to Leibniz's claim. Others defend the principle by expanding the idea of properties to include relational and spatio-temporal qualities, thus restoring the difference. Why does this matter? Because it strikes at the foundation of identity. What makes you you, and not someone else? If a perfect physical copy of you existed, atom for atom, thought for thought, would it be you or someone else? The identity of indiscernibles doesn't just apply to pebbles or particles. It applies to consciousness, memory, and personhood. At its heart, this principle forces us to ask, is being different more than just appearing different? And if no difference can be found, does duality still exist? The hard problem of consciousness. Among the many puzzles in philosophy of mind, none is more enduring or more frustrating than the hard problem of consciousness. Coined by philosopher David Chalmers in the 1990s, the hard problem refers to a gap in our understanding of how and why physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. It's one thing to explain how neurons fire, how vision works, or how memory forms. It's something entirely different to explain how these mechanisms produce the feeling of being, the inner first-person perspective known as qualia. Why does red look red? Why does a rose's scent have a smell at all instead of just being processed like a neutral input? You could scan a brain, track electrical activity, and chart every chemical pathway and still never locate the experience itself. You'd have data about a person seeing red, but you wouldn't know what it's like to be that person seeing that color. That inner what it's likeness is the core of the hard problem. Chalmers distinguishes the hard problem from what he calls easy problems, not because those are simple, but because they're tractable, explaining how a brain reacts to stimuli, how it controls movement, or how it integrates information. These are all complex, but they stay within the realm of physical explanation. The hard problem, by contrast, isn't about function, it's about consciousness itself. Various theories attempt to address it. Materialists argue that consciousness will eventually be explained in physical terms, we just haven't discovered the right framework yet. Others, like dualists, claim that consciousness is fundamentally non-physical, and no amount of brain science will ever explain it. Panpsychists suggest that consciousness may be a basic feature of the universe, like mass or charge, present even in elementary particles, just in primitive forms. There's also illusionism, the view that consciousness as we conceive it doesn't actually exist. It's a trick of the brain, a construct with no true inner light. This position, while radical, attempts to dissolve the hard problem by denying its premise. But for many, the hard problem endures because consciousness is the one thing we are absolutely certain of. Everything else, bodies, objects, even other people, can be doubted. But our own experience, whatever it is, cannot be ignored. The hard problem asks, how does the physical become personal? How do brain cells give rise to beauty, sorrow, hunger, or joy? And as of now, no one knows. Gaia hypothesis. The Gaia hypothesis, proposed by scientist James Lovelock in the 1970s, and later supported by microbiologist Lynn Margulis, presents a provocative view of Earth, not just as a planet teeming with life, but as a self-regulating, complex, quasi-organismic system. According to the hypothesis, living organisms and the inorganic components of the Earth, atmosphere, oceans, soil, form a tightly coupled feedback loop that maintains conditions suitable for life. Life doesn't merely adapt to its environment, it helps shape and stabilize it. The name Gaia comes from the ancient Greek goddess of Earth, chosen to evoke the idea of a unified, living system. But the Gaia hypothesis isn't mystical, at least not in its scientific formulation. Lovelock's original insight was that Earth's temperature, atmospheric composition, ocean salinity, and other variables seem remarkably stable over geological timescales, stability that isn't easily explained by physics or chemistry alone. Instead, he argued, life itself helps regulate the planet's environment in ways that promote its own continued existence. One of the early examples used to support the hypothesis is the regulation of Earth's temperature. Despite the sun's output increasing over billions of years, Earth's climate has remained within a narrow range that supports life. This could be due, in part, to biological processes like photosynthesis removing carbon dioxide or plankton influencing cloud formation that create stabilizing feedback loops. However, the Gaia hypothesis comes in several forms. The weak version claims simply that life influences the environment, which is widely accepted in science. The strong version, more controversial, suggests that the biosphere behaves as a single organism with purposeful self-regulation. Critics argue that such teleological language, implying intentional behavior or design, has no place in evolutionary science. Philosophically, Gaia raises deep questions about identity, purpose, and the boundary between organism and environment. Can a planet be considered alive? If life and its environment are so tightly entangled, does it still make sense to separate them conceptually? Gaia challenges the anthropocentric view that humans are separate from nature. It suggests we are part of a vast, interdependent system with no privileged vantage point. Some thinkers have extended Gaia into moral and political domains, arguing that if Earth is a kind of living system, then harming it is not just environmental degradation, it's a form of systemic violence. The Gaia hypothesis doesn't tell us how to live, but it invites us to rethink what life means on a planetary scale. Free rider problem. The free rider problem is a concept in ethics, economics, and political philosophy that highlights a tension between individual rationality and collective well-being. It occurs when individuals benefit from a shared resource or public good without contributing to its cost, taking a free ride while others bear the burden. Consider a simple example: a neighborhood where residents voluntarily fund a streetlight. Once installed, the streetlight benefits everyone, lighting the road, deterring crime, making it safer to walk at night. But each resident also knows that if others pay for it, they can still enjoy the benefits without spending a cent. If everyone thinks this way, no one contributes, and the streetlight never gets built. This isn't just a quirk of community planning. It's a recurring problem in large-scale societies. Public goods like clean air, national defense, public broadcasting, and even herd immunity from vaccines all require collective participation. But since individuals can enjoy these benefits without direct contribution, they may be tempted to free ride, undermining the very system that supports them. At its core, the free rider problem reveals a breakdown in moral coordination. Acting in pure self-interest can lead to outcomes that are bad for everyone. The dilemma is particularly thorny when participation is voluntary. Why contribute to a cause if your individual effort won't make a visible difference? And yet, if everyone reasons this way, the system collapses. Philosophers and economists have explored various solutions. One approach is incentivization, offering rewards for participation or penalties for abstention. Another is social norms, cultivating moral or cultural expectations that encourage cooperation. Governments often step in with compulsory taxation or regulation, recognizing that voluntary systems can't sustain essential goods on goodwill alone. But there's a deeper philosophical layer. What does the free rider problem say about justice and fairness? Is it unjust to benefit from a good you didn't help produce? Does fairness require contribution, or only that no one be excluded from benefits? The issue also echoes ancient philosophical questions about civic duty and communal life. Plato argued that harmony arises when all classes in society do their part. Rousseau warned of the tension between individual freedom and the general will. The free rider problem lives in this space, between personal liberty and collective responsibility. In modern times, the stakes have only grown. Climate change, vaccine hesitancy, and digital privacy all involve vast commons threatened by individual inaction. The free rider problem is no longer theoretical, it's existential. Simulation hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis proposes a provocative possibility that reality as we know it is not fundamental, but a highly advanced simulation, something akin to an unimaginably complex computer program. First, formally argued by philosopher Nick Bostrom in 2003, the idea suggests that if technological civilizations continue to advance, and if they gain the capacity to run detailed simulations of their ancestors, then the number of simulated beings would vastly outnumber real ones. Therefore, it may be statistically more likely that we are simulated beings than biological originals. Bostrom's argument isn't just science fiction speculation, it's a trilemma. He claims one of the following must be true. Nearly all civilizations go extinct before reaching simulation-level tech. Advanced civilizations choose not to run ancestor simulations, or we are almost certainly living in a simulation. The third option, while bizarre, follows logically if the first two are false. But what does it mean to live in a simulation? If reality is made up of code, does that change the value of experience, the nature of truth, or the foundations of morality? And who or what is running it? Critics point out that the argument depends on speculative assumptions about future computing power, civilizational behavior, and the metaphysical possibility of consciousness arising in artificial substrates. Others argue that the idea is unfalsifiable. If we're inside the simulation, we'd only see what the simulation lets us see. That makes it a philosophical dead end, immune to empirical testing. Yet the simulation hypothesis has captured the imagination of both philosophers and technologists. Thinkers like Elon Musk and Neil deGrasse Tyson have expressed openness to the idea. Movies like The Matrix, Inception, and Tron have visualized worlds within worlds, exploring what it means for experience to be real if reality is constructed. The hypothesis also intersects with age-old philosophical questions. Descartes wondered whether a malicious demon could be deceiving him about the nature of reality. The simulation hypothesis is in many ways a modern version of that doubt. It invites the same skepticism. How can we be sure that what we see, hear, and feel corresponds to anything real? If we are simulated, does it matter? Would pain hurt less? Would love be less sincere? For many, the answer is no. What matters is not what reality is made of, but how we live within it. Meaning doesn't depend on metaphysical certainty. It depends on presence, on choice, on consciousness, simulated or not. Skepticism. Skepticism is the philosophical stance that questions whether certain or even any knowledge is possible. It is not simply doubt, but a disciplined, methodical challenge to the assumptions we make about the world, our senses, our reasoning, and even the reliability of our own minds. At its most radical, skepticism doesn't deny truth. It doubts our ability to know it. The origins of philosophical skepticism trace back to ancient Greece, especially the Pyrrhonists and the academic skeptics. Pyrrho of Elis, the movement's namesake, taught that because appearances are deceptive and every argument has an equally strong counter-argument, the wise person should suspend judgment entirely, a state called epoche. This suspension, he believed, leads not to despair but to tranquility, because it frees the mind from the anxiety of dogmatic belief. The academic skeptics, associated with Plato's later followers, developed a more intellectualized form of doubt. They argued that certainty is impossible, and that wise persons should always withhold assent, even while acting on probability. In the modern era, skepticism was reignited by René Descartes, who famously subjected all his beliefs to radical doubt in order to find a foundation of certainty. He asked, "What if all my perceptions are illusions? What if a demon is deceiving me?" His answer was cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Even if everything else is false, the act of thinking proves that something, the self, is real. Yet Descartes' solution did not end skepticism. David Hume took it further, questioning whether we can ever justify beliefs about causality or the uniformity of nature. When we say fire causes heat, we're really just projecting our habits of association, not observing necessity itself. This undermines science's foundation. If we can't justify inductive reasoning, we can't claim knowledge about the future, or even the structure of reality. Skepticism also plays a central role in epistemology, the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Can we trust perception, memory, logic? If every belief requires justification, and every justification is itself a belief, we end up in an infinite regress. At some point, all knowledge rests on unprovable assumptions, but skepticism isn't always destructive. It's also a safeguard. It prevents blind faith, demands better reasoning, and keeps inquiry honest. Scientific method itself is grounded in a form of structured skepticism. Test, doubt, revise. The question isn't whether to doubt, but what to do with doubt. Skepticism at its best doesn't paralyze, it sharpens. Eternalism versus presentism. Eternalism and presentism are competing theories in the philosophy of time, each offering a radically different answer to a simple question: what exists? For the presentist, the answer is straightforward. Only the present moment exists. The past is gone, and the future hasn't happened yet. For the eternalist, time is like space. All moments, past, present, and future, exist equally and eternally. Presentism feels intuitively true. After all, we experience life moment by moment as a flowing now. The past seems like memory, the future like imagination. This view aligns with our common sense and emotional life. When we say that moment is gone, we mean it. Presentism supports ideas like change, loss, becoming, and impermanence. It matches how we feel about time. But physics complicates this intuition. According to the theory of relativity, especially Einstein's special relativity, there is no objective now that applies across the universe. Different observers, depending on their velocity, can disagree about whether two events are simultaneous. This undermines the notion of a universal present and opens the door for eternalism. Eternalists argue that time is like a fourth dimension. Just as all points in space exist regardless of where you are standing, all points in time exist regardless of when you are. The entire timeline, births, deaths, revolutions, extinctions, is laid out like a frozen block. This block universe view holds that the passage of time is an illusion. We don't move through time, we are just located at particular coordinates within it. One major implication of eternalism is the challenge it poses to free will and moral responsibility. If the future already exists, are we truly choosing anything, or are we just playing out a script that's already written? Presentists push back. They argue that eternalism denies the reality of change and experience. If the future is already real, what does it mean to anticipate something? How can we hope, regret, or choose meaningfully in a world where everything is already there? Some philosophers attempt hybrid theories, trying to preserve the reality of the present while acknowledging the mathematical structure of time in physics. Others go further, proposing that time itself may be emergent, not fundamental to the universe but arising from deeper, timeless processes. At its heart, the debate between eternalism and presentism asks, is time something we pass through or something we are embedded within? Are we carving paths through a dynamic river or standing frozen in a timeless block? Ontological argument. The ontological argument is one of the most famous and controversial arguments for the existence of God, not because it relies on empirical evidence or religious scripture, but because it attempts to prove God's existence using pure reason alone. Originating in the 11th century with Saint Anselm of Canterbury, it begins with a definition and ends with a bold conclusion that God necessarily exists. Anselm's formulation goes like this: God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Even the atheist, he argues, understands this definition, at least as a concept. But if God exists only in the mind and not in reality, then a greater being could be conceived, one that exists both in the mind and in reality. Therefore, God must exist in reality as well. Otherwise, we're contradicting the very definition we started with. This reasoning is abstract and elegant, but also deeply puzzling. Can existence be a property? Can you define something into existence? Critics have long attacked the argument. The 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that existence is not a predicate, not a property like size or color that adds anything to the concept of a thing. Saying God exists doesn't tell us what God is like. It only asserts that such a being is. Therefore, the ontological leap from concept to reality is invalid. Others have responded by offering revised versions. The 20th century logician Kurt Gödel developed a highly technical modal version of the ontological argument, using the tools of mathematical logic. In this version, God's existence is treated as a necessary truth in all possible worlds. If it's possible that a necessarily existing God exists, then that God must exist in every possible world, including ours. Still, the ontological argument remains divisive. To some, it's a masterstroke of metaphysical reasoning, proof that certain truths about existence can be uncovered by reason alone. To others, It's a linguistic trick, confusing the structure of ideas with the nature of reality. Philosophically, the ontological argument raises deep questions beyond theology. Can logic alone tell us anything about the external world? Are there necessary beings? Is possibility enough to entail existence? Whether one finds the argument persuasive or flawed, it has provoked centuries of debate. It dares to ask if God is the greatest being conceivable. Could not existing be a limitation? And if so, is existence itself somehow embedded in the very idea of divinity? Mereological paradox. Mereology is the branch of philosophy concerned with parts and wholes, the relationships between things and their components. While that may sound simple, the questions it raises quickly spiral into some of the most perplexing paradoxes in metaphysics. One such enigma is the mereological paradox, which challenges our understanding of when a collection of parts becomes a whole, and whether that whole has any existence apart from its parts. Imagine a bicycle disassembled in a garage. The tires, the chain, the frame, the handlebars, they're all lying in a heap. Does the bicycle still exist? If someone were to say, "There's a bicycle in the garage," would that be true? Or is there just a pile of parts? Now imagine those parts are scattered to different locations. Is there still a bicycle, or has it ceased to exist entirely? Mereological questions like these aren't just about language, they're about the nature of identity and existence. One core issue is composition. Under what conditions do parts compose a whole? The special composition question, famously posed by philosopher Peter van Inwagen, asks, when do some things form a further thing? Is there a rule that tells us when individual components become a unified object? Some philosophers argue for mereological nihilism, the view that only fundamental particles exist, and that things like tables, ships, or even people are convenient fictions. Others endorse universalism, the idea that any collection of parts, no matter how loosely connected, forms a whole. According to this view, a pile of socks and a toaster on the moon technically form an object. But most people fall somewhere in between, struggling to define when exactly a thing becomes more than the sum of its parts. The mereological paradox arises from this ambiguity. If a whole is nothing more than its parts arranged in a certain way, what gives it unity? Is the bicycle different from the pile of parts only because of its arrangement? And if the arrangement changes slowly over time, as with the ship of Theseus, at what point does it become a different object altogether? These questions matter not just for metaphysics, but also for identity, ethics, and even law. If a person loses a limb, are they still the same person? If a work of art is partially restored or altered, is it still the original? If an ecosystem loses one species, does the system remain intact? Mereology forces us to confront the uneasy truth that our world is built on unstable boundaries, and that the things we call wholes may be more fragile and more arbitrary than we care to admit. Quietism. Quietism is a philosophical stance, defined not by what it asserts, but by what it refuses to do. It is at its core a rejection of philosophy's traditional ambitions to construct grand theories, solve timeless problems, or arrive at ultimate truths. Quietists believe that many of philosophy's deepest puzzles are not real problems at all, but confusions born from misuse of language, misplaced expectations, or conceptual muddles. The goal of quietism is not to build, but to dissolve. It aims not at answers, but at clarity and peace. This perspective is most famously associated with the later work of Ludwig Wittgenstein in Philosophical Investigations. Wittgenstein argued that philosophical problems arise when language goes on holiday, when words are lifted from their ordinary contexts and forced into abstract frameworks where they no longer make sense. He saw the philosopher's task not as explaining reality, but as describing the use of language with enough care to eliminate confusion. When done properly, he believed, the urge to philosophize disappears. Nothing remains to be said. Quietism is not nihilism. It does not claim that truth, morality, or knowledge are meaningless. Rather, it sees much of philosophical theorizing as unnecessary. It's a kind of philosophical minimalism, a refusal to make metaphysical claims unless absolutely compelled. In this way, it resembles certain spiritual traditions like Zen Buddhism, where enlightenment comes not from accumulation, but from stripping away. Critics of quietism see it as evasive or self-defeating. If all philosophy is just confusion, then isn't quietism itself a philosophical theory? And if so, doesn't it contradict itself? Others argue that quietism offers no guidance in the face of real ethical or political dilemmas, where action, not detachment, is needed. Yet quietism has its appeal, especially in an age flooded with speculation and argument. It offers a kind of intellectual modesty, a recognition of the limits of language and the futility of endless theorizing. It invites us to step back from metaphysical battles and look at how we actually use words, how meaning arises in everyday life, not in abstract formulations. Quietism doesn't resolve the mysteries of existence. It suggests that perhaps they don't need resolving. That peace may lie not in solving the puzzle, but in realizing it wasn't a puzzle to begin with. Paradox of choice. The paradox of choice refers to the idea that while having some choice is good, having too much can lead to anxiety, paralysis, and dissatisfaction. This counterintuitive concept challenges one of the foundational assumptions of modern life, that freedom is defined by the number of options available to us. The more choices we have, we assume, the better our lives will be. But what if abundance undermines happiness? Psychologist Barry Schwartz popularized this idea in his 2004 book, The Paradox of Choice. Why More is Less? Drawing on empirical research and philosophical insights, he argued that modern societies, especially affluent, consumer-driven ones, suffer not from a lack of freedom, but from an excess of it. In a world where every decision, from buying toothpaste to choosing a career path, offers dozens, even hundreds of possibilities, people are often left overwhelmed and dissatisfied, regardless of what they choose. The paradox manifests in several ways. First, there's choice paralysis, the inability to decide at all because the number of options is too large. This is not just a minor inconvenience. It affects major life decisions. Should I marry this person, or keep looking? Take this job, or pursue another degree? Move to this city or that one? The fear of making the wrong choice can be so great that it prevents action altogether. Then there's regret and counterfactual thinking. Even after choosing, people often dwell on the options they didn't take, imagining how things might have been better. The more options there are, the more possibilities for second-guessing, and the more regret one is likely to feel. Finally, there's the escalation of expectations. When we have many choices, we expect more. If we choose from 10 vacation packages, and it turns out mediocre, we're disappointed, not just by the outcome, but by the sense that we should have done better. In this way, abundance breeds dissatisfaction, not joy. Philosophically, the paradox of choice intersects with notions of freedom, responsibility, and the good life. Is true freedom simply the absence of constraint, or does it require a kind of structure, limits that give choices meaning? If every door is open, how do we know which one matters? The paradox doesn't argue against freedom. It argues for purposeful freedom, the kind that comes not from infinite options, but from meaningful ones. Sometimes, less really is more, not because we lack possibility, but because we gain clarity. Copernican principle. The Copernican principle is a philosophical and scientific idea rooted in humility. At its core, it asserts that the Earth, and by extension humanity, is not in a privileged or central position in the universe. It originates from Nicholas Copernicus's revolutionary 16th century model of the solar system, which displaced Earth from the center of the cosmos and placed the sun there instead. That change was more than astronomical. It reshaped our understanding of our place in the grand scheme of things. Before Copernicus, geocentric models assumed that the heavens revolved around us. To think otherwise was heresy, both religious and philosophical. But Copernicus, by proposing a heliocentric model, forced a shift. Earth became just another planet, orbiting an ordinary star in an unfathomably vast cosmos. That shift has echoed across centuries, not just in astronomy, but in our worldview. The Copernican principle generalizes this idea. We should assume we are not special or central, whether in space, time, biology, or significance. In cosmology, this principle supports the idea that the laws of physics apply uniformly throughout the universe. When we observe distant galaxies, we assume they obey the same laws as we do. This assumption underlies modern theories, like the Big Bang and cosmic inflation. But the Copernican principle also extends to deeper philosophical territory. It challenges anthropocentrism, the belief that humans are the focal point of existence. It invites us to consider that intelligent life may not be unique, that Earth's history is not the universe's blueprint, and that our time in the cosmos is just one small chapter in an unimaginably long story. Ironically, while it began as a scientific idea, the Copernican principle carries heavy existential weight. It undermines comforting narratives of human centrality. If we're not at the center of space or time or meaning, then what is our role? Does our insignificance imply meaninglessness, or does it demand that we find meaning in humility, in accepting our small place with grace? Some critics argue that the Copernican principle, if taken too far, can become its own dogma. Not all situations are uniform. There may be exceptions, structures, or local conditions that matter. Still, the principle remains a powerful caution. Be wary of centering yourself in a universe that likely doesn't notice. The Copernican principle doesn't belittle us. It challenges us. It tells us we are not the center, but that doesn't mean we are irrelevant. Meaning may not come from our location in the cosmos, but from how we respond to it. Socratic irony. Socratic irony is not about sarcasm, nor is it simply a rhetorical trick. It is a philosophical method rooted in humility, curiosity, and the pursuit of truth. At its heart, Socratic irony is a form of strategic self-deprecation, a way of pretending ignorance in order to expose the ignorance of others. But it's more than just clever dialogue. It is a disciplined approach to knowledge, one that challenges authority, certainty, and dogma. We find its clearest expression in the dialogues of Plato, where Socrates, the central figure, engages in conversations with politicians, poets, generals, and craftsmen. Socrates rarely claims to know anything. He positions himself as a seeker, not a teacher. "I know that I know nothing," he says, a phrase that embodies the paradox at the heart of his method. By claiming ignorance, he invites others to share their knowledge. But as he questions them, it becomes clear that their beliefs are often confused, contradictory, or unexamined. This is Socratic irony in action. It is not mockery. It is a mirror. Socrates doesn't tell people they are wrong. He asks questions until they realize it themselves. His irony lies in the contrast between his apparent ignorance and his actual insight. It's a humility that disarms, allowing truth to emerge not through argument, but through careful, relentless inquiry. The point of this irony is not to humiliate, it's to awaken. Socratic dialogue isn't about winning, it's about transforming the soul. Socrates believed that true wisdom began with recognizing one's own ignorance. By stripping away illusions of knowledge, he opened the door to genuine understanding. His irony was a tool to reveal the difference between opinion and truth. In modern contexts, Socratic irony remains a powerful tool. It underpins much of the critical thinking taught in philosophy, law, and education. When a teacher answers a student's question with a question, or when a lawyer cross-examines a witness by leading them through their own reasoning, they're using a form of Socratic method. The goal is not to dominate but to clarify, to move from confusion to insight. But Socratic irony also carries risk. It can be misunderstood as manipulation or condescension. It requires patience, self-awareness, and a genuine commitment to dialogue. When used sincerely, it becomes a way of cutting through noise and ego, leading toward clarity. Socratic irony reminds us that wisdom begins not with certainty, but with the courage to ask, "What do I really know?" Naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy is a mistake in reasoning that occurs when one attempts to derive moral conclusions, statements about what ought to be, directly from purely factual premises about what is. In simpler terms, it's the error of assuming that just because something is natural or occurs in nature, it is therefore good, right, or morally acceptable. The term was first coined by British philosopher G.E. Moore in his influential 1903 work, Principia Ethica. Moore argued that it is fallacious to define good in terms of any natural property, such as pleasure, evolutionary success, or biological fitness. According to Moore, good is a simple, indefinable quality. It cannot be reduced to anything else. Trying to define it in terms of natural facts is to commit the naturalistic fallacy. One of Moore's most famous tools for exposing this error is his open question argument. Suppose someone says, "Pleasure is good." Moore would respond, "Is it a meaningful question to ask? Is pleasure really good?" If the answer is yes, if it's a genuine question, then good and pleasure cannot mean the same thing. If they were identical, the question would be meaningless. This suggests that moral concepts are not reducible to natural or descriptive ones. The naturalistic fallacy has had a significant impact on moral philosophy. It challenges attempts to ground ethics in science, biology, or psychology. For example, if someone argues that selfishness is morally acceptable because it is evolutionarily advantageous, they are moving from an is to an ought, committing the naturalistic fallacy. Just because nature produces something doesn't mean we should morally endorse it. This fallacy also appears in everyday moral reasoning. People often claim that because a behavior is unnatural, it must be wrong, or that because a diet is natural, it must be healthy and virtuous. These assumptions are not logically valid. Nature is not a moral compass. It includes altruism and cooperation, but also cruelty, exploitation, and indifference. Describing how things are tells us little about how they should be. The challenge, then, is to construct moral reasoning that doesn't rely on factual shortcuts. Moral judgments require justification beyond appeals to biology or custom. The naturalistic fallacy warns us against confusing explanation with justification and description with prescription. Ultimately, the fallacy reminds us that ethics is not simply a branch of science. It's a domain of values, meaning, and human judgment, and it cannot be reduced to the machinery of the natural world. Evil demon hypothesis. The evil demon hypothesis is a radical thought experiment proposed by René Descartes in the 17th century. It is designed to push skepticism to its absolute limit, to challenge not just what we believe, but the very possibility of knowing anything at all. Imagine, Descartes suggests, that instead of living in a stable, coherent world, you are being deceived by an all-powerful, malicious entity, a demon whose sole purpose is to mislead you. This demon is clever, omnipotent, and utterly dedicated to convincing you of a false reality. It manipulates your senses, your memory, your reasoning, everything. How can you be certain that anything you perceive is real? How can you trust your beliefs, your logic, even your understanding of mathematics? This hypothesis serves a precise philosophical purpose: Descartes was searching for a foundation of knowledge that was absolutely certain, something that could not be doubted. By imagining an evil demon, he strips away all external sources of belief. The senses may be lies, the physical world may not exist, even arithmetic might be unreliable. In doing so, he reduces knowledge to its barest minimum. But there is one thing the demon cannot deceive, the fact that you are doubting. If you doubt, you must exist, as a mind, as a thinking thing. This insight leads to Descartes' famous conclusion, cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Even in a world of total deception, the existence of the self as a thinker is undeniable. The evil demon, in this way, ironically becomes a tool for discovering the one thing that cannot be faked. The evil demon hypothesis is more than a historical curiosity. It remains one of the clearest expressions of radical skepticism. It forces us to question how we justify our beliefs, what counts as evidence, and whether any belief is truly beyond doubt. In modern times, its spirit lives on in scenarios like the brain in a vat thought experiment, or the simulation hypothesis. What if our reality is a sophisticated illusion, an elaborate trick played by machines or malevolent forces? But Descartes was not a nihilist. His demon was a method, not a conclusion. Once he established the certainty of the self, he rebuilt knowledge from that foundation. Still, the evil demon haunts epistemology, a constant reminder that certainty is hard-won, and that trust in perception, reason and science is built not on guarantees, but on critical reflection. Hume's guillotine. Hume's guillotine is a powerful philosophical observation attributed to 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. It marks a sharp boundary between what is and what ought to be, a distinction so foundational that it reshaped moral philosophy. Hume's insight is simple but devastating. You cannot logically derive a moral ought from a factual is. That is, no matter how many facts you compile about the world, those facts alone cannot tell you what is morally right or wrong. In a treatise of human nature, Hume noticed that writers often made a subtle but critical shift. They began by describing how the world is, human behavior, social conditions, natural laws, and then, without justification, concluded how people ought to behave. This leap, he argued, was not supported by logic. There's a gap between descriptive statements and prescriptive ones, and anyone attempting to bridge that gap needs to provide a clear explanation of how the leap is made. This gap came to be known as Hume's guillotine, a term coined much later. Like a philosophical blade, it slices cleanly between facts and values. You can describe a situation endlessly. Humans are naturally selfish. Animals eat their young. Societies have always had hierarchies. But none of these descriptions tell us what we should do. They tell us what happens, not what is right. The implications are far-reaching. Hume's guillotine forms the basis of modern meta-ethics, the philosophical study of the nature, scope, and meaning of moral judgments. It raises profound questions. Where do moral values come from, if not from facts? Can they be objective? Are they invented, discovered, or imposed? Hume's insight also puts pressure on attempts to ground ethics in science. For instance, evolutionary biology might explain why we cooperate or punish, but it cannot tell us whether we should do so. Likewise, economic data can show inequality, but it cannot declare inequality unjust, at least not without further moral reasoning. Yet this boundary has its critics. Some argue that facts and values are more intertwined than Hume allowed. If something causes harm, isn't that fact itself morally relevant? Others try to build bridges through intermediate concepts, like human flourishing or well-being, that might turn descriptive claims into prescriptive ones. Still, Hume's guillotine stands as a crucial reminder. Moral conclusions demand more than observation. They require justification, argument, and interpretation. Philosophy doesn't just describe the world, It asks what we should do with it.